Chapter 37 of Haworth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jean Clare. Haworth by Frances Hodgson BURNETT. Section 37. A Summer Afternoon. Let it stay there a while, Murdoch had said. I am not ready for it yet. And it stayed there between the headstone and the old stone wall covered with the long grass and closed in by it. He was not ready for it, yet. The days were not long enough for him as it was. His mother and Tristan rarely saw him, but at such times as they did, each recognized in him a new look and understood it. He began to live a strange, excited life. Rachel French did nothing by halves. He was seen with her constantly. It continually happened that where she was invited, he was invited also. He forgot that he dreaded to meet strangers and had always held aloof from crowds. There were no strangers now and no crowds. In any gatherings, there was only one presence, and this was enough for him. When people would have cultivated him and drawn him out, he did not see their efforts. When men and women spoke to him, they found that he scarcely heard them, and that even as they talked, he had unconsciously veered toward another point. He did things sometimes which made them stare at him. "The fellow is like a ghost," a man said of him once. The simile was not a bad one. He did not think of what he might be winning or losing. For the time being, mere existence was all sufficient. At night, he scarcely slept at all. Often he got up and rambled over the country in the darkness, not knowing where he was going or why he walked. He went through the routine of the day in haste and impatience, doing more work than was necessary, and frequently amazing those around him by losing his temper and missing his mark. French began to regard him with wonder. Diverse things were a source of wonder to French in these days. He understood Rachel less than ever and found her less satisfactory. He could not comprehend her motives. He had become accustomed to feeling that she always had a motive in the background, and he made the natural mistake of supposing that she had one now. But she had none. She had suddenly given way to a mysterious impulse which overmastered her, and she let herself go, as it were. It did not matter to her that the time came when her course was discussed and marveled at. Upon the whole, she felt a secret pleasure in defying public comment as usual and going steadily in her own path. She did strange things, too. She began to go among the people who knew Murdoch best, visiting the families of the men who worked under him and leading them on to speak of him and his way of life. It cannot be said that the honest matrons she honored by her visits were very fond of her or exactly rejoiced when she appeared. They felt terribly out of place and awe-stricken when she sat down on their wooden chairs with her rich dress lying upon the pipe-clayed floors. Her beauty and her grandeur stunned them, however much they admired both. "I tell you, she's a lady," they said. "She knows nowt about poor folks, bless you, but she's getting brass to give way, and she gives it without making a domint. I mun say it puts me out a bit to see her come in, but she does not go without leaving summit." She made no pretense of bringing sympathy and consolation. She merely gave money, and money was an equivalent, and after all it was something of an event to have her carriage stop before the gate and to see her descend and enter in all her splendor. The general vague idea which prevailed was that she meant to be charitable after the manner of her order, but that was a mistake too. It happened at last that one day her carriage drew up before the house at whose window Murdoch's mother and Tristan sat at work. It was Saturday, and Janie Brierly, in her cleanin'-up apparel, opened the door for her. "They're in the parlor," she answered in reply to her question. "Art thou coom to see 'em?" When she was ushered into the parlor in question, Mrs. Murdoch rose with her work in her hand. Tristan rose also and stood in the shadow. They had never had a visitor before, and had not expected such a one as this. They thought at first that she had come upon some errand, but she had not. She gave no reason for her presence other than she would have given in making any call of ceremony. As she sat on the narrow sofa, she saw all the room and its meagerness, its smallness, its scant, plain furnishing, its ugly carpet and walls, the straight black dress of the older woman, the dark beauty of the girl who did not sit down but stood behind her chair, watching. This beauty was the only thing which relieved the monotony of the place, but it was the most grating thing she saw to Rachel French. It roused within her a slow anger. She resented it and felt that she would like to revenge herself upon it quietly. She had merely meant to try the effect of these people and their surroundings upon herself as a fine experiment, but the effect was stronger than she had anticipated. When she went away, Tristan accompanied her to the door. In the narrow passage, Rachel French turned and looked at her, giving her a glance from head to foot. "I think I have seen you before," she said. "You know you have seen me," the girl answered. "I have seen you on the continent. Your apartment was opposite to ours in Paris, when you were with your mother. I used to watch the people go in and out. You are very like your mother." And she left, not looking back once, as if there was no living creature behind, or as if she had forgotten that there was one. Tristan went back into the room within. She sat down, but did not take up her work again. "Do you know why she came?" she asked. "Yes." "Why?" "She came to look at us, to see what manner of people we are, to see how we lived, to measure the distance between our life and hers. As she went away," she went on, "she remembered that she had seen me before. She told me I was very like my mother." She leaned forward, her hands clasped palm to palm between her knees. "There was a man who did my mother a great wrong once," she said. "They had loved each other in a mad sort of way for a long time, but in the end I suppose he got tired, for suddenly he went away. When he was gone, my mother did not speak of him, and it was as if he had never lived, but she grew haggard and dreadful and lost her beauty. I was a little child, and she took me with her and began to travel from one place to another. I did not know why at first, but I found out afterward. She was following him. She found him in Paris, at last, after 2 years. One foggy night she took me to a narrow street near one of the theaters, and after we got there I knew she was waiting for someone, because she walked to and fro between 2 of the street lamps, dragging me by the hand. She walked so for half an hour, and then the man came, not knowing we were there. She went to him, dragging me with her, and when she stood in front of him, threw back her veil and let the light shine upon her. She lifted her hand and struck him full upon the face, panting for breath. "I am a woman," she said. "I am a woman, and I have struck you. Remember it to your last hour, as I shall." I thought that he would strike her back, but he did not. His hands fell at his sides, and he stood before her, pale and helpless. I think it was even more terrible than she had meant it to be. Mrs. Murdoch stopped her, almost angrily. "Why do you go back to it?" she demanded. "Why should you think of such a story now?" "It came to me," she answered. "I was thinking that it is true that I am like her. I bear a grudge such a long time, and it will not die out. It is her blood which is in me." She spoke the truth. Early in the afternoon, Rachel French, sauntering about the garden in the sun, saw Murdoch coming down the road toward the house. Not until he had first seen her, however. His eyes were fixed upon her when she turned, and it seemed as if he had found it impossible to remove them, even for a breath's time. Since his glance had first caught the pale blue of her dress, he had not once looked away from it. All the morning, in the midst of the smoke and the din of the workrooms, he had been thinking of the hours to come. The rest of the day lay before him. The weather was dazzling. The heat of summer was in the air. The garden was ablaze with flowers, whose brightness seemed never to have been there before. There was here and there the drone of a bee, and now and again a stir of leaves. The day before had been of another color, and so might the morrow be, but today left nothing to be believed in except its own sun and beauty. When at last he was quite near to her, he seemed for a little while to see nothing but the faint pale blue of her dress. He never forgot it afterward, and never remembered it without a sense of summer heat and languor. He could not have told what he said to her, or if he at first spoke at all. Soon she began to move down the path, and he followed her, simply followed her, stopping when she stopped to break a flower from its stem. It was as she bent forward once that she told him of what she had done. "This morning," she said, "I went to see your mother." "She told me so," he answered. She broke the stem of the flower and stood upright, holding it in her hand. "You do not ask me why I went." "Why?" he asked. Their eyes met, and she was silent for a moment. Then she said, with perfect deliberateness, "I have known nothing of the life you live. I wanted to see it for myself. I wanted to bring it near." He drew quite close to her, his face pale, his eyes burning. "Near," he repeated, "to bring it near. Do you know what you have said?" "To bring it near," she said again, with no less deliberateness than before, but with a strange softness. Just for today, she had told herself, she would try the sensation of being swept onward by the stream. But she weighed herself as she spoke, and weighed him and his passion, and her power against its force. But he came no closer to her. He did not attempt to touch even her hand or her dress. His own hands fell helplessly at his sides, and he stood still before her. "Oh God," he said in a hushed voice, "how happy I am." End of Chapter 37.
Chapter 38 of Haworth's. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Claire Redick. Haworth's by Frances Hodgson BURNETT. Chapter 38. God Bless You. Late the same night, Mrs. Haworth, who had been watching for her son alone in the grand desolate room in which it was her lot to sit, rose to her feet on hearing him enter the house. The first object which met his eye when he came in was her little figure and her patient face turned toward the door. As he crossed the threshold, she took a few steps as if to meet him, and then stopped. "Jem!" she exclaimed. "Jem!" Her voice was tremulous, and her eyes bright, with the indefinable feeling which seized upon her in the moment she saw his face. Her utterance of his name was a cry of anxiousness and fear. "What?" he said. "Are you here yet?" He came to her, and laid a hand upon her shoulder in a rough caress. "You'd better go to bed," he said to her. "It's late, and I've got work to do." "I felt," she answered, "as if I'd like to wait and see you. I knowed I should sleep better for it, I always do." There was a moment's pause in which she stroked his sleeve with her withered hand. Then he spoke. "Sleep better," he said. "That's a queer notion. You've got queer fancies, you women. Some on you." Then he stooped and kissed her awkwardly. He always did it with more or less awkwardness and lack of ease, but it never failed to make her happy. "Now you've done it," he said, "you'd better go, old lady, and leave me to finish what I've got to do." "It's late for work, Jem," she answered. "You oughtn't try yourself so much." "It ain't work so much," he said, "as thinking. There's something I've got to think out." For the moment he seemed quite to forget her. He stood with his hands thrust into his pockets and his feet apart, staring at the carpet. He did not stir when she moved away, and was still standing so when she turned at the door to look at him. What she saw brought her back, hurried and tearful. "Let me stay," she cried. "Let me stay. There's trouble in your face, Jem, for I see it. Don't keep it from me, for the sake of what we've been through together in times that's past." He bestirred himself and looked up at her. "Trouble," he repeated. "That's not the word. It's not trouble, old lady, and it's not that can be helped. There's me and it to fight it out. Go and get your sleep and leave us to it." She went slowly and sadly. She always obeyed him, whatever his wish might be. When the last sound of her faltering feet had died away upon the stairs, he went to the sideboard and poured out a glass of raw brandy and drank it. "I want something to steady me," he said, "and to warm me." But it did not steady him at least. When he sat down at the table, the hand he laid upon it shook. He looked at it curiously, clinching and unclinching it. "I'm pretty well done for when it goes like that," he said. "I'm farther gone than I thought. It's all over me, over and through me. I'm shaking like a fool." He broke out with a torrent of curses. "Is it me that's sitting here?" he cried, "or some other chap? Is it me that looks gone again on every side, or a chap that's used her to it?" Among all his pangs of humiliation and baffled passion, there was not one so subtle and terrible in its influence upon him as his momentary sense of physical weakness. He understood it less than all the rest, and raged against it more. His body had never failed him once, and now for the first time he felt that its power faltered. He was faint and cold, and trembled not merely from excitement, but from loss of strength. Opposite to him, at the other side of the room, was a full-length mirror. Accidentally raising his eyes toward it, he caught sight of his own face. He started back and unconsciously glanced behind him. "Who?" he began, and then he stopped, knowing the face for his own, white-lipped, damp with cold sweat, lined with harsh furrows, evil to see. He got up, shaking his fist at it, crying out through his shut teeth. "Blast her!" he said. "Who's to blame but her?" He had given up all for her, his ambition, which had swept all before it. his greatest strength, his very sins and coarseness, and half an hour ago he had passed the open door of a room, and had seen Murdoch standing motionless, not uttering a word, but with his face clearly transfigured by his ecstasy, and with her hand crushed against his breast. He had gone in to see French, and had remained with him for an hour in one of the parlors, knowing that the two were alone in the other. He had heard their voices now and then, and had known that once they went upon the terrace and talked there. He had grown burning hot and deadly cold, and strained his ears for every sound, but never caught more than a word or low laugh coming from Rachel French. At last he had left his partner, and on his way out, past the open door, they had come back to the room, and Murdoch was saying his good night. He held Rachel French's hand, and she made no effort to withdraw it, but gave it to his caress. She did not move nor speak, but her eyes rested upon his rapt face with an expression not easy to understand. Haworth did not understand it, but the rage which seized and shook him was the most brutal emotion he had ever felt in his life. It was a madness which left him weak. He staggered down the stairs and out into the night blindly, blaspheming as he went. He did not know how he reached home. The sight his mother had seen, and which had drawn a cry from her and checked her midway in the room, had been cause enough for tremor in her. Nothing but the most violent effort had saved him from an outbreak in her presence. He was weaker for the struggle when she was gone. He could think of nothing but of Rachel French's untranslatable face, and of Murdoch's close clasp on her surrendered hand.
"What'd she ever give me?" he cried. "Me that's played the fool for her. What's he done that he should stand there and fondle her as if he'd bought and paid for her? I'm the chap that paid for her. She's mine, body and soul, by George, if every man has his rights."
And then, remembering all that had gone by, he turned from hot to cold again.
"I've stood up agin her for a long time," he said. "And what have I got? Swore I'd make my way with her, and how far have I gone? She's never given me a word, by George, or look that be what another woman would give. She's not even played with me. Most on 'em would have done that, but she's not. She's gone on her way and let me go on mine. She's turned neither right nor left for me. I wasn't man enough."
He wore himself out in the end, and went to the brandy again, and drank of it deeply. It sent him upstairs with heated blood and feverish brain. It was after midnight when he went to his room, but not to sleep. He lay upon his pillow in the darkness, thinking of the things he had done in the past few months, and of the fruit the first seed he had sown might bring forth. "There's things that may happen to any on us, my lad," he said, "and some on 'em might happen to you. If it's Jem Haworth that's to lose, others shan't gain, by George." He had put the light out, and laid in the darkness, and was so lying with his mood at work upon him, when there came a timid summons on the door, and it opened, and someone came in softly. He knew who it was, even before she spoke. "Jem," she said. "Jem, you're not asleep, my dear." "No," he answered. She came to the bedside and stood there. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "Something's a little wrong with me. I'm getting foolish and fearful. I felt as if you wasn't quite safe. I thought I'd come and speak to you." "You're out of sorts," he answered. "You'll have to be looked after." "Oh, it's nothing but my foolish way," she replied. "You're very good to me, and me so full of fancies. Would you mind me kneeling down and saying a prayer here to myself, as I used to when you was a boy, Jem? I think it'd do me good. Would you mind it?" "No," he answered hoarsely. "Kneel down." And she knelt and grasped for his hand and held it, and he heard her whispering in the dark, as he had been wont to hear her nearly 30 years before. When it was over, she got up and kissed him on the forehead. "God bless you, my dear," she said. "God bless you," and went away. End of chapter 38.
Chapter 49 of Haworth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jean Clare. Haworth by Frances Hodgson BURNETT. Chapter 49, If Aught's for Me, Remember It. Before he left the house at night, Murdoch had a brief interview with his mother. "I am going to London as he went," he said, "on the same errand. The end may be what it was before. I have felt very sure, but he was sure too." "Yes," the woman answered, "he was very sure." "I don't ask you to trust it, or me," he said. "He gave a life to it. I have not given a year, and he was the better man, 1,000-fold. I," he said, with a shadow falling on his face, "have not proved myself as he did. He never faltered from the first." "No," she said. "Would to God he had." But when he went, she followed him to the door and said the words she had refused him when he had at first told her he had taken the burden upon his shoulders. "God speed you," she said. "I will try to believe." His plan was to go to his room, pack his case securely, and then carry it with him to the station in time to meet the late train he had decided on taking. He let himself into the works as usual, and found his way along the passage in the darkness, though he carried his lantern. He knew his way so well that he did not need it there. But when he reached Haworth's room and put out his hand to open the door, he stopped. His touch met no resistance, for the door was wide open. The discovery was so sharp a shock to him that for a few seconds he remained motionless. But he recovered himself in a second or so more. It might have been the result of carelessness after all. So he turned on his light and went into his cell and began his task. It did not take him long. When he had finished, the wooden case was simply a solid square brown parcel which might have contained anything. He glanced at his watch and sat down a minute or two. "There is no use in going too early," he said. And so he waited a little, thinking mechanically of the silence inside and the darkness out, and of the journey which lay before him. But at last he got up again and took his burden by the cord he had fastened about it. "Now," he said, "it is time." At the very moment the words left his lips, there was a sound outside the door, and a rush upon him. He was seized by the throat, flung backward into the chair he had left, and held there. He made no outcry. His first thought when he found himself clutched and overpowered was an incongruous one of Brierly sitting on the roadside and looking up at him in panic-stricken appeal. He understood in a flash what his terror had meant. The fellow who held him by the collar, there were 3 of them, and one was Redick, shook him roughly. "Where is it?" he said. "You know whatten we've come for, my lad." Murdoch was conscious of a little chill which passed over him, but otherwise he could only wonder at his lack of excitement. No better place to finish a man than such a one as this at dead of night, and there was not one of the 3 who had not evil in his eye. But he spoke without a tremor in his voice, with the calmness of being utterly without stay or help. "Yes, I suppose I know," he said. "You came to me for it before. What are you going to do with it?" "Smash it to hell," said one concisely, "and thee too." It was not a pleasant thing to hear by the half-light of a lantern in a place so deadly still. Murdoch felt the little chill again, but he remembered that after all he had one slender chance if he could make them listen. "You are making a blunder," he began. Redick stopped him by addressing his comrades. "What art thou standing hearkening to him fur?" he demanded. "Smack him in the mouth and stop him." Murdoch gave a lurch forward, which it gave his captor some trouble to restrain. He turned dangerously white, and his eyes blazed. "If you do, you devil," he panted, "I'll murder you." "Where is the thing we come for?" said the first man, and then he caught sight of the package, which had fallen upon the floor. "Happen it's in theer," he suggested. "Open it, chaps." Then all at once Murdoch's calmness was gone. He shook in their grasp. "For God's sake," he cried, "don't touch it. Don't do it a harm. It's a mistake. It has nothing to do with your trade. It would be no hurt to you if it were known to the whole world. For God's sake, believe me." "We've heerd a different mek o' tale from that," said Redick, laughing. "It's a lie, a lie. Who told it?" "Jem Haworth," he was answered. "Jem Haworth, as it were made for." He began to struggle with all his strength. He cried out aloud and sprang up and broke loose and fought with the force of madness. "You shall pay for it," he shrieked, and 3 to 1 as they were, he held them for a moment at bay. "Give him the knob stick," cried one. "At him with it." It was Redick who aimed the blow at him, a blow that would have laid him a dead man among them, but it never fell, for he sprang forward with a mighty effort and struck the bludgeon upward, and as it fell with a crash at the opposite side of the room, they heard, even above the tumult of their struggle, a rush of heavy feet, a voice every man among them knew, and the sound they most dreaded, the sharp report of a pistol. "It's Haworth!" they shouted. "Haworth!" And they made a dash at the door in a body, stumbling over one another, striking and cursing, and the scoundrel who first got through and away was counted a lucky man. Murdoch took a step forward and fell, so close to the model that his helpless hand touched it as it lay. It was not long before he returned to consciousness. His sudden loss of strength had only been a sort of climax body and mind had reached together. When he opened his eyes again, his first thought was a wonder at himself and a vague effort to comprehend his weakness. He looked up at Haworth, who bent over him. "Lie still a bit, lad," he heard him say. "Lie and rest thee." He no sooner heard his voice than he forgot his weak wonder at himself and a stronger wonder at him. He was ashen pale, and a tremor shook him as he spoke. "Lie still and rest thee," he repeated, and he touched his head with an approach to gentleness. "They thought there was more than me," he said, "and they're not fond of powder and lead. They're better used to knobsticks and vitriol in the dark." "They meant to murder me," said Murdoch. "Aye, make sure of that. They weren't for play. They've had their minds on this for a month or two. If I'd been a minute later—" He did not finish. A queer spasm of the throat stopped him. He rose the next instant and struck a match and turned the gas on to full blaze. "Let's have light," he said. "There's a look about the place I can't stand." His eyes were bloodshot, his face looked gray and deeply lined, and his lips were parched. There was a new haggardness upon him, and he was conscious of it and tried to bear it down with his old bravado. "They'll not come back," he said. "They've had enough for tonight. If they'd known I was alone, they'd have made a stand for it. They think they were in luck to get off." He came back and sat down. "They laid their plans better than I thought," he added. "They got over me for once, devil take 'em. How art thou now, lad?" Murdoch made the effort to rise and succeeded, though he was not very strong upon his feet, and sank into a chair, feeling a little irritated at his own weakness. "Giddy," he answered, "and a trifle faint. It's a queer business. I went down as if I'd been shot. I have an hour and a half to steady myself before the next train comes in. Let me make the best of it." "You'll go tonight?" said Haworth. "There's a stronger reason than ever that I should go," he answered. "Let me get it out of the way and safe, for heaven's sake." Haworth squared his arms upon the table and leaned on them. "Then," he said, "I've got an hour and a half to make a clean breast of it." He said it almost with a swagger, and yet his voice was hoarse, and his coolness a miserable pretense. "Ask me," he said, "how I came here." And not waiting for a reply, even while Murdoch gazed at him bewildered, he answered the question himself. "I came," he said, "for a good reason. For the same reason that's brought me here every night you've been at work." Murdoch repeated his last words mechanically. He was not quite sure the man was himself. "Every night I've been at work?" "Aye, every one of 'em. There's not been a night I've not been nigh you and ready." A memory flashed across Murdoch's mind with startling force. "It was you I heard come in," he cried. "It was not fancy." "Aye, it was me." There was a moment's silence between them, in which Murdoch thought with feverish rapidity. "It was you," he said, with some bitterness at last. "You who set the plot on foot?" "Aye, it was me." "I could have done the job I wanted to do in a quicker way," he went on after a second's pause, "but that wasn't my humor. I'd a mind to keep out of it myself, and I knew how to set the chaps on as would do it in their own way." "What do you mean by it?" cried Murdoch. "Were you devil enough to mean to have my blood?" "Aye, while I was in the humor. That and worse." Murdoch sprang up and began to pace the room. His strength had come back to him with a fierce sense of repulsion which seized him. "It's a blacker world than I thought," he said. "We were friends once. Friends!" "So we were," he said hoarsely. "You were the first chap I ever made friends with, and you'll be the last. It's brought no good to either of us." "It might," returned Murdoch, "if—" "Let me finish my tale," he said, even doggedly. "I said to myself before I came you should hear it. I swore I'd stop at naught, and I kept my word. I sowed a seed here and there, and the soil was just right for it. They were in the mood to hearken to Aught, and they hearkened. But there came a time when I found out that things were worse with you than with me, and had gone harder with you. If you'd won where I lost, it would have been different. But you lost most of the two. You'd the most to lose, and I changed my mind." He stopped a second and looked at Murdoch, who had come back and thrown himself into his chair again. "I've said many a time that you were a queer chap," he went on, as if half dubious of himself. "You are a queer chap. At the start you got a hold on me, and when I changed my mind you got a hold on me again. I swore I'd undo what I'd done if I could. I knew if the thing was finished and you got away with it, they'd soon find out it was naught they need fret about, so I swore to see you safe through. I gave you the keys to come here to work, and every night I came and waited until you'd done and gone away. I brought my pistols with me and kept a sharp lookout. Tonight I was late, and they'd laid their plans and got here before me. There's the beginning, and there's the end." "You saved my life," said Murdoch. "Let me remember that. I changed my mind and swore to undo what I'd done. There's naught for me in that, my lad, and plenty to go again me." After a little he pushed his chair back. "The time's not up," he said. "I've made short work of it. Pick up thy traps, and we'll go over the place together and see that it's safe." He led the way, carrying the lantern, and Murdoch followed him. They went from one end of the place to the other and found all quiet. The bars of a small lower window had been filed and wrenched out of place, Mr. Reddie and his friends having made their entrance through it. "They've been on the lookout many a night before they made up their minds," said Haworth, "and they chose the right place to try." Afterward they went out together, locking the door and the iron gates behind them, and went down in company to the dark little station with its dim, twinkling lights. Naturally, they did not talk very freely. Now and then there was a blank silence of many minutes between them. But at last the train thundered its way in and stopped, and there was a feeble bustle to and fro among the sleepy officials and an opening and shutting and locking of doors. When Murdoch got into his empty compartment, Haworth stood at its step. At the very last he spoke in a strange hurry. "When you come back," he said, "when you come back, perhaps—" There was a porter passing with a lantern, which struck upon his face and showed it plainly. He shrank back a moment as if he feared the light, but when it was gone he drew near again and spoke through the window. "If there's aught in what's gone by that's for me," he said, "remember it." And with a gesture of farewell he turned away and was gone. End of chapter 49.
Chapter 40 of Haworth's. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mia. Haworth's by Frances Hodgson BURNETT. Look out. The next morning, French rather surprised Murdoch by walking into his cell with an evident intention of paying him a somewhat prolonged visit. It was not, however, the fact of his appearing there which was unusual enough to excite wonder, but a certain degree of mingled constraint and effusiveness in his manner. It was as if he was troubled with some mental compunctions which he was desirous of setting at rest. At times he talked very fast and in a comparatively light and jocular vein, and again he was silent for some minutes, invariably rousing himself from his abstraction with sudden effort. Several times Murdoch found that he was regarding him with a disturbed air of anxiety. Before going away, he made an erratic and indecisive tour of the little room, glancing at drawings and picking up first one thing and then another. "You've a good many things here," he said, "of one kind and another." "Yes," Murdoch answered absently. French glanced around at the jumble of mechanical odds and ends, the plans and models in various stages of neglect or completion. "It's a queer place," he commented, "and it has an air of significance. It's crammed with ideas, of one kind and another." "Yes," Murdoch answered as before. French approached him and laid his hand weakly on his shoulder. "You are a fellow of ideas," he said, "and you have a good deal before you. Whatever disappointments you might meet with, you would always have a great deal before you. You have ideas. I," with apparent inconsequence, "I haven't, you know." Murdoch looked somewhat puzzled, but he did not contradict him, so he repeated his statement. "I haven't, you know. I wish I had." Then he dropped his hand and looked indefinite again. "I should like you to always remember that I am your friend," he said. "I wish I could have been of more service to you. You're a fine fellow, Murdoch. I've admired you. I've liked you. Don't forget it." And he went away carrying the burden of his indecision and embarrassment and good intention with such amiable awkwardness. That day Murdoch did not see Rachel French. Circumstances occurred which kept him at work until a late hour. The next day it was the same story, and the next also. A series of incidents seemed to combine against him, and at the end of each day found him worn out and fretted. But on the fourth he was free again, and early in the evening found himself within sight of the iron gates. Every pulse in his body throbbed as he passed through them. He was full of intense expectation. He could scarcely bear to think what was before him. His desperate happiness was a kind of pain. One of his chief longings was that he might find her wearing the pale blue dress again, and that when he entered she might be standing in the center of the room as he had left her. Then it would seem as if there had been no nights and days between the last terribly happy moment and this. The thought which flashed across his mind that there might possibly be someone else in the room was a shock to him. If she's not alone, he said to himself, it will be unbearable. As he passed up the walk, he came upon a tall white lily blooming on one of the border beds. He was in a sufficiently mystical and emotional mood to be stopped by it. It is like her, he said, and he gathered it and took it with him to the house. The first thing upon which his eye rested when he stood upon the threshold of the room was the pale blue color, and she was standing just as he had left her. It seemed to him upon the very same spot upon which they had parted. His wish had been realized so far at least. He was obliged to pause a moment to regain his self-control. It was an actual truth that he could not have trusted himself so far as to go in at once. It was best that he did not. The next instant she turned and spoke to a third person on the other side of the room, and even as she did so caught sight of him and stopped. "Here's Mr. Murdoch," she said, and paused, waiting for him to come forward. She did not advance to meet him, did not stir until he was scarcely more than a pace from her. She simply waited, watching him as he moved toward her, as if she were a little curious to see what he would do. Then she gave him her hand, and he took it with a feeling that something unnatural had happened, or that he was suddenly awakening from a delusion. He did not even speak. It was she who spoke, turning toward the person whom she addressed before he entered. "You've heard us speak of Mr. Murdoch," she said, and then to himself, "This is Monsieur Saint-Méran." Monsieur Saint-Méran rose and bowed profoundly. He presented, as his best points, long, graceful limbs and a pair of clear grey eyes, which seemed to hold their opinions in check. He regarded Murdoch with an expression of suave interest, and made a well-bred speech of greeting. Murdoch said nothing. He could think of nothing to say. He was never very ready of speech. He bowed with an uncertain air, and almost immediately wandered off to the other end of the room, holding his lily in his hand. He began to turn over the pages of a book of engravings, seeing none of them. After a little while, a peculiar perfume close to him attracted his attention, and he looked downwardly vacantly and saw the lily, and then he laid it down and moved farther away. Afterward, he did not know how long afterward, French came in. He seemed in a very feverish state of mind, talking a great deal and rather inanely, and forcing Murdoch to reply and join in on the conversation. Monsieur Saint-Méran held himself with a graceful air of security and self-poise, and made gentle efforts at scientific remark which should also have an interest for genius of a mechanical and inventive turn. But Murdoch's replies were vague. His glance followed Rachel French. He devoured her with his eyes, a violence which she bore very well. At last, he had not been in the house an hour. He left his chair and went to her. "I'm going away," he said in an undertone. "Good night." She did not seem to hear him. She was speaking to Saint-Méran. "Good night," he repeated, in the same tone, not raising it at all, only giving it an intense, concentrated sound. She turned her face toward him. "Good night," she answered. As he went away, French followed him to the door with erratic and profuse regret, which she did not hear at all. When he got outside, he struck out across the country. The strength with which he held himself in check was a wonder to him. It seemed as if he was not thinking at all, that he did not allow himself to think. He walked fast, it might even be said violently. The exertion made his head throb and his blood rush through his veins. He walked until at last his heart beat so suffocatingly that he was forced to stop. He threw himself down, almost fell down upon the grass at the wayside, and lay with shut eyes. He was giddy and exhausted, and panted for breath. He could not have thought then, if he would, he had gained so much at least. He did not leave the place for an hour. When he did so, it was to walk home by another route, slowly and almost weakly. This route led him by the Brierly cottage, and as he neared it, he was seized with a fancy for going in. The door was ajar, and light burned in the living room, and this drew him toward it. Upon the table stood a basket filled with purchases, and near the basket lay a shawl which Janey wore upon all occasions requiring a toilet. She had just come in from her shopping, and sat on a stool in her usual posture, not having yet removed the large bonnet which spread its brim around her small face, a respectable and steady-going aureole enlivened with bunches of flowers which in their better days had rejoiced Mrs. Brierly's heart with exceeding great joy. She looked up as he came in, but she did not rise. "Eh, it's thee, is it?" she remarked. "I thought it were time that you were comin'. Th'st not been here for nigh a month." "I have been doing a great deal." "Aye," she answered, "I suppose so." She jerked her thumb toward Granny Dixon's basket chair, which stood empty. "She's taken down," she said. "She were taken down a week sin', and a nice time we're havin' nursin' her. None of us can do anything with her but mother. She can settle her, thank the Almighty." She rested her sharp little elbows upon her knees and her chin upon both palms and surveyed him with interest. "Has thee seed him?" she demanded suddenly. "Who?" he asked. "Him," with a nod of her head. "The foreigner as it's staying at Meester French's. You must have seen him. He's been there 3 days. I saw him this evening. I thought thou might have seen him. He come in on Monday. He come from France. I should know," with a tone of serious speculation. "I should not have thought she'd had a Frenchman." She moved her feet and settled herself more conveniently without moving her eyes from his face. "I do not think much of Frenchmen myself," she proceeded, "and neither does mother, but they say this is a rich man and a grand one. She's lived in France a good bit, and happen she does not mind their ways. She's knowed him before." "When?" he asked. "When she were there. She lived there, you know." Yes, he remembered, she had lived there. He said nothing more, only sat watching the little stunted figure and sharp small face with a sense of mild fascination, wondering dully how much she knew and where she had learned it all, and what she would say next. But she gave him no further information, chiefly because she had no more on hand, there being a limit even to her sagacity. She became suddenly interested in himself. "You are as pale as you'd have the whooping cough," she remarked. "What's wrong with you?" "I'm tired," he answered, "worn out." That was true enough, but it did not satisfy her. A matter-of-fact, matronly mind arrived at a direct solution of the question. "Did you ever think," she put it to him, "as she had you?" He had no answer to give her. He began to turn deathly white about the lips. She surveyed him with increased interest and proceeded. "Mother and me's talked it over," she said. "We talk the halfpenny reader, and there were a tale in it as to the one the nobility as went a workin' chap. And mother, she said as happen she were like her and do it. But I said she would not. The chap in the tale turned out to be an earl, and had been kidnapped by the gypsies, but you never were kidnapped, and she's none of the soft kind. The Lady Geraldine were a different make. There were not much in her to my mind. She were always making out a brass were not, and talking about a humble virtue, as if there were not like it. You would not catch her taking that road. Mother, she'd sit and cry until the baby's bishop were wet through, but I never sit down to cry about myself. She's gotten the chap in the end, and he turned out to be an earl after all, but I told mother as marrying a working man were not in her line." Murdoch burst into a harsh laugh and got up. "I've been pretty well talked over, it seems," he said. "I didn't know that before." "Aye," replied Jane, coolly. "We've talked you over a good bit. Are you going?" "Yes," he answered, "I am going." He went out with an uncertain movement, leaving the door open behind him. As he descended the steps, light from the room, slanting out into the darkness, struck athwart a face, the body pertaining to which seemed to be leaning against the palings, grasping them with both hands. It was the face of Mr. Brierly, who regarded him with a mingled expression of anxiety and a desire to procreate. "Is it you?" he whispered, as Murdoch neared him. "Yes," he was answered, somewhat shortly. Mr. Brierly put out a hand and plucked him by the sleeve. "I've been waiting for you," he said in a sonorous whisper which only failed to penetrate the innermost recesses of the dwelling through some miracle. Murdoch turned out of the gate. "Why?" he asked. Mr. Brierly glanced toward the house uneasily, and also up and down the road. "Let's get out of the way a bit," he remarked. Murdoch walked on, and he shuffled a few paces behind him. When they got well into the shadow of the hedge, he stopped. Suddenly he dropped upon his knees, and crawling through a very small gap into the field behind, remained there for a few seconds, then he reappeared, panting. "There's no one there," he said. "I wouldn't have risked there being one of 'em lying under the hedge." "One of whom?" Murdoch inquired. "I did not say who," he answered. When he stood on his feet again, he took his companion by the button. "There's a friend of mine," he said, "and he sent a message to you. This here's it. Look out." "What does it mean?" Murdoch asked. "Speak more plainly." Mr. Brierly became evidently disturbed. "Nay," he said, that there's plain enough for me. It's a do my business, in quick time if I—" He stopped and glanced about him again, and then without warning threw himself, so to speak, on Murdoch's shoulder and began to pour a flood of whispers into his ear. "There were a chap as were a fool," he said, "and he was drawed into being a bigger fool than common. It were him as get you in trouble with the strikers. He did not mean no ill, and he says, I tell him to look out. I'll run the risk. He knowed what were going on, and he says, I'll tell him to look out." "Who is he?" Murdoch interposed. Mr. Brierly fell back a pace, perspiring profusely and dabbing at his forehead with his cap. "He were a friend of mine," he stammered. "A friend of mine as has gotten a way of getting himself into trouble, and he says I'll tell him to look out." "Tell him for me," said Murdoch, "that I'm not afraid of anything that may happen." It was a rash speech, but it was not so defiant as it sounded. His only feeling was one of cold carelessness. He wanted to get free and go away and end his night in the silent room at home, but Mr. Brierly kept up with him, edging toward him apologetically as he walked. "You're set again the chap for being a fool," he persisted breathlessly, "and I don't blame you." He set again his son. "He's a misfortunate chap, as is allus in trouble. It set heavy on him, and says he, I'll tell him to look out." At a turn into a by-lane he stopped. "I'll go this road," he said, "and I'll tell him as I've done it." End of chapter 40. Recording by Mia. Chapter 41 of Haworth's. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mia. Haworth's by Frances Hodgson Burnett. It has all been a lie. In a week's time, Samran had become a distinct element in the social atmosphere of Broxton and vicinity. He fell into his place at Rachel French's side with the naturalness of a man who felt he had some claim upon his position. He was her father's guest. They had seen a great deal of each other abroad. Any woman might have felt his well-bred homage a delicate compliment. He was received as an agreeable addition to society. He attended her upon all occasions. From the window of his workroom, Murdoch saw him drive by with her in her carriage, saw him drop into the bank for a friendly chat with French, who regarded him with a mixture of nervousness and admiration. Haworth, having gone away again, had not heard of him. Of late the works had seen little of its master. He made journeys hither and hither, and on his return from such journeys invariably kept the place in hot water. He drove the work on, and tyrannized over the hands from foremen to puddlers. At such times there was mysterious and covert rebellion, and some sharp guessing as to what was going on, but it generally ended in this: upon the whole, the men were used to being bullied, and some of them worked the better for it. Murdoch went about his work as usual, although there was not a decent man on the place who did not gradually awaken to the fact that some singular change was at work upon him. He concentrated all his mental powers upon what he had to do during work hours, and so held himself in check, but he spent all his leisure in a kind of apathy, sitting in his cell at his work-table in his old posture, his forehead supported by his hands, his fingers locked in his tumbled hair. Sometimes he was seized with fits of nervous trembling which left him weak. When he left home in the morning, he did not return until night, and he ate no midday meal. As yet he was only drifting here and there. He had arrived at no conclusions. He did not believe in his own reasoning. The first blow had simply stunned him. A man who had been less reserved, and who had begun upon a fair foundation of common knowledge, would have understood. He understood nothing but his passion, his past rapture, and that a mysterious shock had fallen upon him. He lived in this way for more than a week, and then roused himself up to make a struggle. One bright sunny day, after sitting dumbly for half an hour or so, he staggered to his feet and took up his hat. "I'll try again," he said mechanically. "I'll try again. I don't know what it means. It may have been my fault. I don't think it was, but it may have been. Perhaps I expected too much." And he went out. After he had been absent for some minutes, French came in from the bank. He had been having a hard morning of it. The few apparently unimportant indiscretions in the way of private speculation of which he had been guilty were beginning to present themselves in divers unpleasant forms, and to assume an air of importance he had not believed possible. His best ventures had failed him, and things which he was extremely anxious to keep from Haworth's ears were assuming a shape which would render it difficult to manage them privately. He was badgered and baited on all sides, and naturally began to see his own folly. His greatest fear was not so much that he should lose the money he had risked as that Haworth should discover his luckless weakness and confront and crush him with it. As he stood in fear of his daughter, so he stood in fear of Haworth, but his dread of Haworth was, perhaps, the stronger feeling of the two. His very refinement added to it. Having gained the object of his ambition, he had found it not exactly what he had pictured it. Haworth had not spared him. The very hands had derided his enthusiastic and strenuous efforts. He had secretly felt that his position was ridiculous and provocative, of satire among the unscientific herd. When he had done anything which should have brought him success and helped him to assert himself, it had somehow always failed, and now he sat down in the managerial chair before Haworth's great table, strewn with papers and bills. He had shut the door behind him, and was glad to be alone. "I am extremely unfortunate," he faltered aloud. "I do not know how to account for it," and he glanced about him helplessly. Before the words had fairly left his lips, his privacy was broken in upon. The door was flung open, and Murdoch came in. He had evidently walked fast, for he was breathing heavily, and he had plainly expected to find the room empty. He looked at French, sat down, and wiped his lips. "I want you," he began, with labored articulation, "I want you to tell me what I have done." French could only stare at him. "I went to the house," he said, "and asked for her." He did not say for whom, nor was it necessary that he should. French understood him perfectly. "I swear I saw her standing at the window as I went up the path. She had a purple dress on, and a white flower in her hair, and Saint-Méran was at her side. Before, the man at the door had never waited for me to speak. This time he stood and looked at me. I said, 'I want to see Miss French.' He answered, 'She's not at home.' 'Not at home?' breaking into a rough laugh. 'Not at home to me.' He clinched his fist and dashed it against the chair. 'What does it mean?' he cried out. 'What does it mean?' French quaked. I don't know,' he answered, and his own face gave him the lie. Murdoch caught the words up and flung them back at him. 'You don't know?' he cried. 'Then I will tell you. It means that she has been playing me false from first to last.' French felt his position becoming weaker and weaker. Here was a state of affairs he had never seen before. Here was a madness which concealed nothing, which defied all, which flung all social presuppositions to the winds. He ought to have been able to palter and equivocate, to profess a well-bred surprise and some delicate indignation, to be dignified and subtle, but he was not. He could only sit and wonder what would come next, and feel uncomfortable and alarmed. The thing which came next he had not expected any more than he had expected the rest of the outbreak. Suddenly a sullen calmness settled upon the young fellow, a calm which spoke of some fierce determination. "I don't know why I should have broken out here like this before you," he said. "Seeing you here when I expected to fight it out alone surprised me into it. But there is one thing I am going to do. I'll hear the truth from her own lips. When you go home I will go with you. They won't turn me back then, and I'll see her face to face. I—" began French, and then added, completely overwhelmed, "perhaps it would be best." "Best," echoed Murdoch with another laugh. "No, it won't be best. It'll be worst. But I'll do it for all that." And he dropped his head upon the arms he had folded on the chair's back, and so sat in a forlorn, comfortless posture, not speaking, not stirring, as if he did not know that there was any presence in the room but his own. And he kept his word. As French was going out into the street at dusk, he felt a touch on his shoulder, and turning, found Murdoch close behind him. "I'm ready," he said, "if you are." When they reached the house, the man who opened the door stared at them blankly, which so irritated French that he found an excuse for administering a sharp rebuke to him about some trifle. "They're always making some stupid blunder," he said to Murdoch as they passed upstairs to the drawing-room, but Murdoch did not hear. It was one of the occasions on which Rachel French reached her highest point of beauty. Her black velvet dress was almost severe in its simplicity, and her one ornament was the jeweled star in her high coiffure. Monsieur Saint-Méran held his place at her side. He received Murdoch with empressement, and exhibited much tact and good feeling, but Murdoch would have none of him. He had neither tact nor experience. His time did not come until the evening was nearly over, and it would have never come if he had not at last forced her to confront him by making his way to her side with a daring which was so novel in him that it would have mastered another woman. Near her he trembled a little bit, but he said what he had come to say. "To-day," he said, "when I called you, your servant told me you were not at home." She paused a moment before answering, but when she did answer he trembled no more. "That was unfortunate," she said. "It was not true. I saw you at the window." She looked him quietly in the face, answering him in 2 words. "Did you?" He turned on his heel and walked away. His brain whirled. He did not know how he got out of the room. He was scarcely conscious of existence until he found himself out of doors. He got beyond the gate, and into the road, and to the end of the road, but there he stopped and turned back. He went back until he found he was opposite to the house again, looking up at the lighted window. He did not know why. A sharp rain was falling, but he did not feel it. He stood staring at the window, mechanically plucking at the leaves on the hedge near him. He scarcely knew whether it was a curse or a sob which fell from his lips and awakened him at last. "Am I going mad?" he said. "Do men go mad through such things? God forbid. It has all been a lie. A lie. A lie." End of chapter 41. Recording by Mia.
Chapter 42 of Haworth's. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Haworth's by Frances Hodgson BURNETT. Chapter 42. In 2 days, Haworth returned. He came from the station one morning, not having been home. He did not go to the works, but to the bank and straight into French's private room. The look this unhappy gentleman gave him when he saw him was a queer mixture of anxiety, furtive query, and amiably frank welcome. The frank welcome a very faint element indeed, though it was brought to light by a violent effort. Haworth shut the door and locked it, and then turned upon him, his face black with rage. "Say summat," he ground out through his teeth. "Say summat as'll keep me from smashing every bone in your body." French gave him one hopeless glance and wilted into a drooping, weakly protesting, humiliated figure. Don't be so severe, Haworth," he said. I blast you," burst in Haworth, pitilessly. "You've ruined me." He spoke under his breath. No one in the room beyond could hear a word. But it was 1,000 times more terrible than if he had roared at the top of his voice, as was his custom when things went amiss. "You've ruined me," he repeated. "You, a chap that's played gentleman manufacturer, a chap I've laughed at, a chap I took in to serve my own ends. Ruin me, by—" "Oh, no," the culprit cried out. "My dear fellow, no. No." Haworth strode up to him and struck his fist against the table. "Have I ever told you a word of what was going on?" he demanded. No. Have I ever let you be aught but what I swore you should be at the first? A fellow to play second fiddle and do what he was told?" French turned pale. A less hard nature would have felt more sympathy for him. "No," he answered, "you have not," and his chin dropped on his breast. Haworth shook his fists in his face. He was in a frenzy of rage and despair. "It's been going from bad to worse for 6 months," he said. "But you were not up to seeing it stare you in the face. Strikes are the things for trade to thrive on." One place after another gone down, and Jem Haworth stood up. "Jem Haworth's outdone 'em all. I've not slept for 3 months, my lad. I've fought it like a tiger. I've not left a stone unturned. I've held my mouth shut and my eyes open. Aye, and held my breath too. I've swore every time I saw daylight that I'd hold it out to the end, and show 'em all what Haworth was made of, and how he stood when the knobs went down at the first drive. I'd sooner have held than what's bound to come now. And it's you that's done it. You've lost me £20,000. 20,000, when 10's worth more to me than 100 was a 12-month since." French quailed like a woman. Are you going to murder me?" he said. "You look as if you were." Haworth turned on his heel. "You're not worth it," he answered, "or I'd do it, by the Lord Harry." Then he came back to him. "I've paid enow for what I've never had, by George," he said, with bitter grimness. "For what you have?" French began. Haworth stopped him by flinging himself down in a chair near him, so near that their faces were brought within uncomfortably close range of each other. There was no avoiding his eye. "You know what?" he sneered. "None better." French faltered. "Blast you," said Haworth. "You played her like bait to a fish, in your gentleman's fashion." French felt a little sick. It was not unnatural that he should. A man of refined instincts likes less than any other man to be confronted brutally with the fact that he has, however, delicately, tampered with a coarseness. Haworth went on. You knew how to do it, and you did it, gentleman way. You knew me, and you knew I was hard hit, and you knew I'd make a big throw. That was between us two, though we never said a word. I'd never give up a thing in my life before, and I was mad for her. She knew how to hold me off, and gave me plenty to think of. What else had you, my lad? Haworths didn't want a gentleman. Haworths didn't want brass, and you'd none to give if it did. It wasn't you who was tooken partner. It was what Jem Haworth was aiming at, and has missed by. He got up, and pushing his chair back, made a stride toward the door. French was sure he was going away without another word, but he suddenly stopped and turned back. I'd sooner take hell than what's comin', he repeated in a hoarse whisper. And it's you that's brought it on me. But if I'd got what I aimed at, it might have come in welcome. Then he went out. He went across to the works, and going into his room, he found Murdoch, standing at one of the windows gazing out at something in the street. He was haggard and gaunt and had a vacant look. It occurred to Haworth that some sudden physical ailment had attacked him. He went up to his side. What have you found, lad? He demanded. The next instant his own eyes discovered what it was. An open carriage was just drawing up before the bank. Rachel French sat in it, and St. Méran was with her. He looked at them, a second or so, and then looked at Murdoch, at his wretched face and his hollow eyes. An unsavory exclamation burst from him. What? He cried out after it. There's another man, is there? Is it that? Yes, was Murdoch's monotonous reply. There's another man. End of chapter 42.
Chapter 43 of Haworths. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Haworths by Francis Hodgson BURNETT. Even. The same evening, Monsieur Saint Méran had the pleasure of meeting a person of whom he had heard much, and in whom he was greatly interested. This person was the master of Haworths, who came in after dinner. If he had found Murdoch a little trying and wearisome, Monsieur Saint Méran found Haworth astounding. He was not at all prepared for him. When he walked into the room as if it were his own, gave a bare half-nod to French, and carried himself aggressively to Miss French's side, Saint Méran was transfixed with astonishment. He had heard faint rumors of something like this before, but he never dreamed of seeing it. He retreated within himself and proceeded to study minutely the manners and characteristics of the successful manufacturers of Great Britain. "He's very large," he said, with soft sarcasm to Miss French, "very large indeed." "That," replied Miss French, "is probably the result of the iron trade." The truth was that he seemed to fill the room. The time had passed when he was ill at ease in the house. Now he was cool to defiance. French had never found him so embarrassing as he was upon this particular evening. He spoke very little, sitting in his chair silent, with a gloomy and brooding look. When he directed his attention upon anyone, it was upon Rachel. The prolonged gaze which she occasionally fixed upon her was one of evil scrutiny, which stirred her usually cool blood not a little. She never failed, however, to meet it with composure. At last she did a daring thing. Under cover of a conversation between her father and Saint Méran, she went to the table at his side and began to turn over the books upon it. "I think," she said in an undertone, "that you have something to say to me." "Aye," he answered, "I have that, and the time will come when I shall say it too." "You think I'm afraid to hear it," she continued. "Follow me to the next room and see." Then she addressed her father, speaking aloud. "Your plans for the new bank are in the next room, I believe," she said. "I wish to show them to Mr. Haworth." "Yes," he admitted somewhat reluctantly. "They are on my table." She passed through the folding doors, and Haworth followed her. She stopped at one of the windows and waited for him to speak, and it was during this moment in which she waited that he saw in her face what he had not seen before, a faint pallor and a change which was not so much a real change as a foreshadowing of one to come. He saw it now because it chanced that the light struck full upon her. "Now," she said, "say your say, but let me tell you that I shall listen not because I feel a shadow of interest in it, but because I know you thought I shrank from hearing it." He pushed open the French window and strode onto the terrace. "Step out here," he said. She went out. "This," he said, glancing about him, "This is the place you stood on the night you showed yourself to the strikers." She made no answer. "It's as good a place as any," he went on. "I'm going to have it out with you," he said with bitter significance. Then, for the first time, it struck her that she had overstepped her mark and done a dangerous thing, but she would have borne a great deal sooner than turn back, so she remained. "I've stood it a long time," he said, "and now I'm going to reckon up. There's a good bit of reckoning up to be done betwixt you and me, for all you've held me at arm's length." "I am glad," she put in, "that you acknowledge that I did hold you at arm's length, and that you were not blind to it." "Oh," he answered, "I wasn't blind to it no more than you are blind to the other. And from first to last it's been my comfort to remember that you were not blind to the other, that you knew it as well as I did. I've held to that." He came close to her. "When I gave up what I'd worked 20 years to get, what did I give it up for? For you. When I took French and partner, what did I run the risk for? For you. What was to pay me? You." His close presence in the shadow was so intolerable to her that she could have cried out, but she did not. "You made a poor bargain," she remarked. "Aye, a poor bargain, but you were one in it. You bore it in your mind, and you've bore it there from then till now, and I've got a hold on you through, and that's worth summat to me. If I never came nigh nor touched you, you knew it, and you'd let it be. No other chap can pay more for you than Jem Haworth's paid. I've got that to think of." She made a gesture with her hand. "I, hush!" she cried out. "I will not hear it. Stop it if you can. Call him if you want, and let him hear. The new chap and all. You shall hear, if all Broxton comes. I've paid 25 year of work, and sweat and grime. I've paid Haworth's, for I'm a ruined chap as I stand here, and but for you I'd have got through." There was a shock in these last words. If they were true, the blow would fall on her too. "What?" she faltered. "What do you mean?" "The strike's begun it," he answered laconically, and with a jerk of his thumb toward the room in which her father sat, he finished it. "He tried some of his gentleman pranks in a quiet way, and he lost money on 'em. He's lost it again and again and tried to cover it up with fresh shifts, and it's Haworth's that must pay for 'em. It'll come sooner or later, and you may make up your mind to it." "What were you doing?" she demanded sharply. "You might have known—" "Aye," he returned. "What was I doing? I used to be a sharp chap enow. I've not been as sharp in the last 12 months, and he was up to it. He thought it was his own brass likely. He'd give summat for it as it belonged to him." He came nearer to the light and eyed her over. "You've had your day," he said. "You've made a worse chap of me than I need have been. You lost me a friend. I hadn't counted that in. You've done worse than him than you've done by me. He was the finer maker of the two, and it'll go harder with him. When I came in he was hanging about the roadside, looking up at the house. He didn't see me, but I saw him. He'll be there many a night, I dare say. I'll be ready to swear that he's there now." "Whom do you mean?" "I mean Murdoch." The very sound of his own voice seemed to fire him with rage. She saw a look in his eye which caused her to shrink back, but she was too late. He caught her by the arm and dragged her towards him. A second later, when he released her, she staggered to one of the rustic seats and sank crouching into it, hiding her face into the folds of her dress. She had not cried out, however, nor uttered a sound, and he had known she would not. He stood looking down at her. "A gentleman wouldn't have done it," he said hoarsely. "I am not a gentleman. You've held me off and trampled me underfoot. That'll leave us a bit even." And he turned on his heel and walked away into the darkness. End of Even. Recording by Mia.
Chapter 44 of Haworth's. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Haworth's by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 44. Why do you cry for me? When he said that he had seen Murdoch standing in the road before the house, he had spoken the truth. It was also true that even as they stood upon the terrace, he was there still. He was there every night. Where he slept, or when, or if at all, his mother and Christian did not know. They only knew that he never spent a night at home. They barely saw him from day to day. When he came home in the morning and evening, it was to sit at the table, rarely speaking, scarcely tasting food, only drinking greedily the cup of strong coffee Christian always had in readiness for him. The girl was very good to him in these days. She watched him, in terror of his unnatural mood. He hardly seemed to see them when they were in the room with him. His eyes were hollow and burning bright. He grew thin and narrow-chested and stooped. His hands were unsteady when he lifted anything. When she was alone, Christian said to herself again and again, "He will die. There is no help for it. He will die, or worse." One morning she came down to find him lying on the sofa with closed eyes, and such a deadly face that she almost cried out aloud. But she restrained herself and went into the kitchen as if to perform her usual tasks. Not long afterward she returned carrying a little tray with a cup of hot coffee upon it. "Will you drink this for me?" she said to him. He opened his eyes a little impatiently, but he sat up and drank it. "It's very good," he said, as he fell back again into his old position. "But you mustn't put yourself to trouble for me." Afterward the coffee was always ready for him when he came in, and he got into the habit of drinking it mechanically. The books he had been accustomed to pore over at every leisure moment lay unopened. He neither touched nor looked at them. The two women tried to live their lives as if nothing were happening. They studiously avoided questioning or appearing to observe him. "We must not let him think that we talk of him," Christian said. She showed a wonderful gentleness and tact. Until long afterward, Mrs. Murdoch scarcely knew what support and comfort she had in her. Her past life had planted in her a readiness to despair. "He's like his father," she said once. "He was like him as a child. He is very trusting and faithful, but when his belief is gone, it is all over. He has given up, as his father did before he died. He will not try to live." He did not try to live, but he did not think of death. He was too full of other morbid thoughts. He could not follow any idea far. 1,000 of them came and went, and in the end were as nothing. "Why?" he kept saying to himself, weakly and wearily. "Why was it? What had I done? It was a strange thing to choose me out of so many. I was hardly worth it. To have chosen another man would have served her better." He did not know how the days passed at the works. The men began to gaze at him askance and mutter when he went by. "The fayther went daft," they said. "Is this chap going the same way?" It was only the look of his face which made them say so. He got through his work one way or another, but the days were his dread. The nights, strange and dreadful enough, were better than the broad daylight, with the scores of hands about him and the clangor of hammers and whir of machinery. He fell into the habit of going to the engine-room and standing staring at the engine, fascinated by it. Once he drew nearer and nearer, with such a look in his eye that Flotsam began to regard him stealthily. He went closer, pace by pace, and at last made a step which brought a shout from Flotsam, who sprang upon him and tore him away. "What art at, thou fool?" he yelled. "Does thou want to go home on a shutter?" Wakening with a long breath, he said, "I forgot that was it. I was thinking of another thing." The time came at length when he had altered, so that when he went out his mother and Christian often sat up together, half the night, trembling with a fear neither of them would have put into words. As they sat trying to talk, each would glance at the other stealthily, and when their eyes met, each would start, as if with some guilty thought. On one of the worst and most dreadful of nights, Christian suddenly rose from her seat, crossed the hearth, and threw herself upon her knees before her companion. "I am going out," she said. Don't try to keep me." "It is midnight," said Mrs. Murdoch, "and you don't know where to go." "Yes," the girl returned, "I do. For God's sake, let me go. I cannot bear it." The woman gave her a long look, and then said a strange and cruel thing. "You had better stay where you are. It is not you he wants." "No," she said bitterly, "it is not I he wants, but I can find him and make sure that he will come back, and then you will go to sleep." She left her in spite of her efforts to detain her. She was utterly fearless, and went into the night as if there was no such thing as peril on earth. She did know where to go, and went there. Murdoch was standing opposite the house in which Rachel French slept. She went to him, and put her hand on his arm. "What are you doing here?" she said in a low voice. He turned, and gave her a cold, vacant look. He did not seem at all surprised at finding her dark, beautiful young face at his very shoulder. "I don't know. Can you tell me?" "We have been waiting for you," she said. "We cannot rest when you are away." "Do you want me to go home and go to bed decently and sleep?" he said. "Do you suppose I would not if I could? I always start from here and come back here. I say to myself, it'll take me an hour to reach the place where I can see her window. It is something to hold one's mind in check with. This rambling and forgetting what one has to think about is a terrible thing." "Come home with me," she said. "We will not talk. You can lie on the sofa, and we will go away. I want your mother to sleep." Something in her presence began to influence him to a saner mood. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "It is midnight." "I'm not afraid. I could not bear to stay in the house." We sit there. An idea seemed to strike him suddenly. He stopped her and asked deliberately, "Did you come because you thought I might do myself harm?" She would not answer, and after waiting a second or so, he went on slowly. "I have thought I might myself, sometimes, but never for long. You have no need to fear. I'm always stopped by the thought that perhaps it is not worth it, after all. When things look clearer, I shall get over it. Yes, I think I shall get over it. Though now there seems to be no end. But some day it will come, and I shall get over it. Don't be afraid that I shall do myself harm. If I am not killed before the end comes, I shall not kill myself. I shall know it was not worth it, after all." The tears had been running down her cheeks as she stood, but she bit her lip and forced herself to breathe evenly, so that he might not find her out. But just then, as he moved, a great drop fell upon the back of his hand. He stopped and began to tremble. "Good heavens!" he cried. "You are crying! Why do you cry for me?" "Because I cannot help it," she said in a half-whisper. "I do not cry often. I never cried for anyone before." "I'll take you home," he said, moving slowly along at her side. "Don't cry." End of chapter 44. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 45 of Haworth's. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Haworth's by Francis Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 45. It is worse than I thought. A week or so later, St. Mirren went away. French informed his partner of this fact, with a secret hope of its producing upon him a somewhat softening effect. But Haworth received the statement with coolness. "He'll come back again," he said. "Let him alone for that." The general impression was that he would return. The opinion most popular in the more humble walks of Broxton society was that he had gone to get his'n ready, and hae the papers drawed up, and that he would appear some fine day with an imposing retinue, settle an enormous fortune upon Miss French, and having been united to her with due grandeur and solemnity, would disappear with her to indefinitely foreign parts. There seemed to be little change in Rachel French's life and manner, however. She began to pay rather more strict attention to her social duties, and consequently went out oftener. This might possibly be attributed to the fact that remaining indoors was somewhat dull. Haworth and Murdoch came no more, and after St. Merrin's departure a sort of silence seemed to fall upon the house. French himself felt it when he came in at night, and was naturally restless under it. Perhaps Miss French felt it too, though she did not say so. One morning, Janie Brierly, sitting nursing the baby in the doorway of the cottage, glanced upward from her somewhat arduous task to find a tall and graceful figure standing before her in the sun. She had been too busily engaged to hear footsteps, and there had been no sound of carriage wheels, so the visitor had come upon her entirely unawares. It cannot be said she received her graciously. Her whilom admiration had been much tempered by sharp distrust very early in her acquaintance with its object. "Art thou comin' in?" she asked unceremoniously. "Yes," said Miss French, "I am coming in." Janie got up and made room for her to pass, and when she had passed, gave her a chair, very much overweighted by the baby as she did so. "Does thou want to see mother? If your mother is busy, you will serve every purpose. The housekeeper told me that Mrs. Dixon was ill, and as I was passing, I thought I would come in." Janie's utter disbelief in this explanation was a sentiment not easily concealed, even by an adept in controlling facial expression, and she was not an adept. But Miss French was not at all embarrassed by any demonstration of a lack of faith which she might have perceived. When Janie resumed her seat, she broke the silence by an entirely unexpected observation. She touched the baby delicately with the point of her parasol, very delicately indeed. "I suppose," she remarked, "that this is an extremely handsome child." This with the air of one inquiring for information. "Nay, he is na," retorted Janie unrelentingly. "He's good enow, but he never were hurt wi' good looks. None on 'em were, and he's fussed out a lot. I should think thou could see that for thysen." "Oh," replied Miss French, "then I suppose I am wrong. My idea was that at that age children all looked alike." "Like him?" said Janie dryly. "Did thou think as that did?" As the young Brierly in question was of a stolid and unornamental type, uncertain of feature and noticeable chiefly for a large and unusually bald head of extraordinary phrenological development, this gave the matter an entirely novel aspect. "Perhaps," said Miss French, "I scarcely regarded it from that point of view." Then she changed the subject. "How is Mrs. Dixon?" she inquired. "She's naither better nor worse," was the answer, "and a mort o' trouble." "That is unfortunate. Who cares for her?" "Mother. She's the only one as can do aught wi' her." "Is there no one else she has a fancy for? Your father, for instance?" inquired Miss French. "She canna bide the sight o' him, and he's feart to go nigh her. The only man as she iver looked at were Murdoch," answered Janie. "I think I remember his saying she had made friends with him. Is she as fond of him now?" I do not know if I could ca' it being fond of him. She is not fond of nobody, but she says he's getting a bit more sense than the common run. It is rather good-natured on his part to come to see her. He does not come to see her. He has na been nigh the house for a month. He's been ill, hissin, or summat. He's up and about, but he'd getten a face like death the last time I seed him. Happen he's gone off like his father. How is that? Didna then know, with some impatience, as he went crazy over summat he were making, and 'deed cause he could not make it out to finish it. It's the very thing Murdoch took up his sin, and the strikers were so set again. I think I remember. There was a story about the father. Do you think he is really ill? Murdoch? Aye, I do. Mackless noise, Thomas Henry. This to the child. That is a great pity. Ah, there is the carriage. One of her gloves had been lying upon her lap. When she stood up, it dropped. She bent to pick it up, and as she did so, something fell tinkling upon the flag floor and rolled under a table. It was one of her rings. Janey brought it back to her. It mun ha' been too large for thee, she said, or thou'rt getting thin. Seems like thou'rt a bit different to what thou were, with a glance at her. Never mind that, she answered sharply, as she handed her some money. Give this to your mother. And she dropped the ring into her purse instead of putting it on again, and went out to her carriage. Janey stood and watched her. She's a bit thinner, or summat, she remarked, but she need not mind that. It's genteel enow to be thin, and I do not know as it had hurt her. Rachel French went home, and the same afternoon Murdoch came to her for the last time. He had not intended to come. In his wildest moments he had never thought of going to her again, but as he passed along the road, intending to spend the afternoon in wandering across the country, he looked up at the windows of the house, and a strange fancy seized upon him. He would go in and ask her the question he had asked himself again and again. It did not seem to him at the time a strange thing to do. It looked wonderfully simple and natural in his strained and unnatural mood. He turned in at the gate with only one feeling, that perhaps she would tell him, and then it would be over. She saw him come up the path, and wondered if the man at the door would remember the charge she had given him. It chanced that he did not remember, or that he was thrown off his guard. She heard feet on the stairs in a few seconds, and almost immediately Murdoch was in the room. What she thought, when being brought thus near to him, she saw and recognized the dreadful change in him, God knows. She supported herself with her hand upon the back of her chair as she rose. There was a look in his face almost wolfish. He would not sit down, and in 3 minutes broke through the barrier of her effort at controlling him. It was impossible for her to control him as she might have controlled another man. "I have only a few words to say," he said. "I have come to ask you a question. I think that is all. Only to ask you a question." "Will you tell me," he said, "what wrong I have done you?" She put her other hand on the chair and held it firmly. "Will you tell me," she said, almost in a whisper, "what wrong I have done you?" She remained so, looking at him and he at her, with a terrible helplessness, through a moment of dead silence. She dropped her face upon her hands as she held the chair, and so stood. He fell back a pace, gazing at her still. "I have heard of women who fancy themselves injured," he said, planning to revenge themselves upon the men who had intentionally or unintentionally wounded their pride. "I remember such things in books I have read, not in real life. And once or twice the thought has crossed my mind that at some time in the past I might, in my poor ignorance, have presumed or blundered in some way to anger you, and that this has been my punishment. It is only a wild thought, but it was a straw to cling to, and I would rather believe it, wild as it is, than believe that what you have done has been done wantonly. Can it be? Is it true?" "No." But she did not lift her face. "It is not?" "No." "Then it is worse than I thought." He said the words slowly and clearly, and they were his last. Having said them, he went away without a backward glance. End of chapter 45. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 46 of Haworth's. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Haworth's by Francis Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 46. Once again. In half an hour's time, Murdoch had left Broxton far behind him. He left the open road and rambled across fields and through lanes. The people in the farmhouses who knew him saw him pass looking straight before him, and walking steadily like a man with an end in view. His mind was full of one purpose, the determination to control himself and keep his brain clear. "Now," he said, "let me think it over. Now, let me look at it in cold blood." The effort he made was something gigantic. It was a matter of physical as well as mental force. He had wavered and been vague long enough. Now the time had come to rouse himself through sheer power of will, or give up the reins and drift with the current, a lost man. At dusk he reached Dillop and roamed about the streets, half conscious of his surroundings. The Saturday night shopping was going on, and squalid women, hurrying past him with their baskets on their arms, glanced up, wondering at his dark face and preoccupied air. "He's no one Dillop," they said. One good woman going so far as to add that she did not like the looks of him neither, with various observations upon the moral character of foreigners in general. He saw nothing of the sensation he created, however. He rambled about erratically until he felt the need of rest, and then went into a clean little shop and bought some simple food and ate it sitting upon the tall stool before the counter, watched by the stout white-aproned matron in charge. "That looks poorly, mister," she said as she handed him his change. He started a little on hearing her voice, but recovered himself readily. "Oh, no," he said. "I'm right enough, I think. I'm an American, and I suppose we are rather a gaunt-looking lot as a rule." "'Merican, art thou?" she replied. "Well, to be sure. Happen that's it," good-naturedly. "I've always heerd they were a poor colour. 'Merican. Well, surely." The fact of his being an American seemed to impress her deeply. She received his thanks. She was not often thanked by her customers, as a mysterious, though not disagreeable, result of his nationality, and as he closed the door after him, he heard, as an accompaniment to the tinkling of the shop bell, her amiably surprised ejaculation, "American! Well, surely." A few miles from Broxton there was a substantial little stone bridge, upon which he had often sat. In passing it, again and again, it had gradually become a sort of resting place for him. It was at a quiet point of the road, and sitting upon it had thought out many a problem. When he reached it on his way back, he stopped, and took his usual seat, looking down into the slow little stream beneath, and resting against the low buttress. He had not come to work out a problem now. He felt that he had worked his problem out in the past 6 hours. It was not worth it, he said. No, it was not worth it after all. When he went on his way again, he was very tired, and he wondered drearily whether, when he came near the old miserable shopping place, he should not falter and feel the fascination strong upon him again. He had an annoying fear of the mere possibility of such a thing. When he saw the light striking slantwise upon the trees, it might draw him toward it as it had done so often before, even in spite of his determination and struggles. Half a mile above the house a great heat ran over him, and then a deadly chill, but he went on steadily. There was this for him, that for the first time he could think clearly and not lose himself. He came nearer to it, and it grew in brightness. He fancied he had never seen it so bright before. He looked up at it and then away. He was glad that having once looked, he could turn away. There had been many a night when he could not. Then he was under the shadow of the trees, and knew that his dread had been only a fancy, and that he was a saner man than he had thought. And the light was left behind him, and he did not look back, but went on. When he reached home, the house was utterly silent. He entered with his latchkey, and finding all dark, went upstairs noiselessly. The door of his own room was closed, and when he opened it he found darkness there also. He struck a match and turned on the light. For a moment its sudden glare blinded him, and then he turned involuntarily toward the farther corner of the room. Why he did so, he did not know at the time. The movement was the result of an uncontrollable impulse, but after he had looked, he knew. The light shone upon the empty chair in its old place, and upon the table, and upon the model standing on it. He did not utter any exclamation. Strangely enough, he did not at first feel any shock or surprise. He advanced toward it slowly, but when at last he stood near it, the shock came. His heart beat as if it would burst. "What falseness is there in me," he cried, "that I should have forgotten it?" He was stricken with burning shame. He did not ask himself how it was that it stood there in its place. He thought of nothing but the lack in himself, which was so deep a humiliation. Everything else was swept away. He sank into the chair and sat staring at it. "I had forgotten it," he said, "forgotten it." And then he put out his hand and touched and moved it and drew it toward him. About an hour afterward he was obliged to go downstairs for something he needed. It was to the sitting-room he went, and when he pushed the door open he found a dim light burning, and saw that someone was lying upon the sofa. His first thought was that it was his mother who had waited for him, but it was not she. It was Christian Murdoch, fast asleep with her face upon her arm. Her hat and gloves were thrown upon the table, and she still wore a long gray cloak, which was stained and damp about the hem. He saw this as soon as he saw her face, and no sooner saw than he understood. He went to the sofa and stood a moment looking down at her, and though he did not speak or stir, she awakened. She sat up and pushed her cloak aside, and he spoke to her. "It was you who brought it back," he said. "Yes," she answered quietly. "I thought that if you saw it in the old place again, you would remember." "You did not forget it." "I had nothing else to think of," was her simple reply. "I must seem a poor sort of fellow to you," he said wearily. "I am a poor sort of fellow." "No," she said, "or I should not have thought it worth while to bring it back." He glanced down at her dress, and then up at her face. "You had better go upstairs to bed," he said. "The dew has made your dress and cloak damp. Thank you for what you have done." She got up and turned away. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he answered, and watched her out of the room. Then he found what he required and went back to his work. Only more than once, as he bent over it, he thought again of the innocent look of her face, as it had rested upon her arm while she slept. End of chapter 46. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 47 of Haworth's. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Haworth's by Francis Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 47. A Footstep. He went out no more at night. From the moment he laid his hand upon the model again, he was safer than he knew. Gradually the old fascination reasserted itself. There were hours of lassitude and weariness to be borne, and moments of unutterable bitterness and disgust for life, in which he had to fight sharp battles against the poorer side of his nature. But always at the worst, there was something which made itself a point to fix thought upon. He could force himself to think of this when, if he had had no purpose in view, he would have been a lost man. The keen sense of treachery to his own resolve stung him. But it was a spur, after all. The strength of the reaction had its physical effect upon him, and sometimes he suddenly found himself weak to exhaustion, so weak that any exertion was impossible, and he was obliged to leave his post at the works and return home for rest. At such times he lay for hours upon the narrow sofa in the dull little room, as his father had done long before, and wore a look so like him that one day his mother, coming into the room not knowing he was there, cried out aloud and staggered backward, clutching at her breast. Her manner toward him softened greatly in these days. It was more what it had been in his boyhood, when she had watched over him with patient and unfailing fondness. Once he awakened to see her standing a few paces from his side, seeming to have been there some moments. "If I had seemed hard to you in your trouble," she said, "forgive me." She spoke without any prelude, and did not seem to expect any answer, turning away and going about her work at once. But he felt that he need feel restless and chilled in her presence no longer. He did not pursue his task at home, but took the model down to the works and found a place for it in his little work cell. The day he did so, he was favored by a visit from Haworth. It was the first since the rupture between them. Since then they had worked day after day with only the door between them. They had known each other's incomings and outgoings, but had been as far apart as if a world separated them. Haworth had known more of Murdoch than Murdoch had known of him. No change in him had escaped his eye. He had seen him struggle and reach his climax at last. He had jeered at him as a poor enough fellow with fine, white-livered fancies and a woman's way of bearing himself. He had raged at and cursed him, and now and then had been lost in wonder at him, but he had never fathomed him from first to last. But within the last few weeks his mood had changed. Slowly, it is true, but it had changed. His bearing had changed, too. Murdoch himself gradually awakened to a recognition of this fact, in no small wonder. He was less dogged and aggressive, and showed less ill will. That he should appear suddenly, almost in his old way, was a somewhat startling state of affairs, but he crossed the threshold coolly. He sat down and folded his arms on the table. "You brought somewhat down with you this morning," he said. "What was it?" Murdoch pointed to the wooden case which stood on a shelf a few feet from him. "It was that," he answered. "That?" he repeated. "What?" "You're at work at it again, are you?" "Yes." "Well, look sharp after it, that's all. There's a grudge bore against it." "I know that," Murdoch answered, "to my cost. I brought it here because I thought it would be safer." "Aye, it'll be safer. Take my advice and keep it close, and work at it at nights, when the place is quiet. There's a key as'll let you in." And he flung a key down upon the table. Murdoch picked it up mechanically. He felt as if he could scarcely be awake. It seemed as if the man must have brought his purpose into the room with him, having thought it over beforehand. His manner by no means disarmed the suspicion. "It is the favor I should have asked, if I had thought." Haworth left his chair. "There's the key," he said abruptly. "Use it. No other chap would get it." He went back to his own room, and Murdoch was left to his surprise. He finished his work for the day and went home, remaining there until night came on. Then he went back to the works, having first told Tristan of his purpose. "I am going to the works," he said. "I may be there all night. Don't wait for me or feel anxious." When the great building loomed up before him in the dark, his mind recalled instantly the night he had entered it before, attracted by the light in the window. There was no light about it now, but that shut in the lantern he carried. The immensity and dead stillness would have been a trying thing for many a man to encounter, but as he relocked the door and made his way to his den, he thought of them only from one point of view. "It is the silence of the grave," he said. "A man can concentrate himself upon his work, as if there was not a human breath stirring within a mile of him." Somehow even his room wore a look which seemed to belong to the silence of night, a look he felt he had not seen before. He marked it with a vague sense of mystery when he set his lantern down upon the table, turning the light upon the spot on which his work would stand. Then he took down the case and opened it and removed the model. "It will not be forgotten again," he thought aloud. "If it is to be finished, it will be finished here." Half the night passed before he returned home. When he did so, he went to his room and slept heavily until daylight. He had never slept as he slept in these nights, heavy, dreamless sleep, from which at first he used to awaken with a start and a perfectly blank sense of loss and dread, but which became at last unbroken. Night after night found him at his labor. It grew upon him. He longed for it through the day. He could not have broken from it if he would. Once, as he sat at his table, he fancied that he heard a lock click, and afterward a stealthy footstep. It was a sound so faint and indistinct that his disbelief in its reality was immediate. But he got up, taking his lantern with him, and went out to look at the entrance passage. It was empty and dark, and the door was shut and locked as he had left it. He went back to his work little disturbed. He had not really expected to find the traces of any presence in the place, but he had felt it best to make the matter safe. Perhaps the fact that once or twice on other nights the same light, indefinite sound fell upon his ear again made him feel rather more secure than otherwise. Having examined the place again, and with the same result, it troubled him no more. He set it down to some ordinary material cause. After his first visit, Haworth came into his room often. Why he came, Murdoch did not understand very clearly. He did not come to talk. Sometimes he scarcely spoke at all. He was moody and abstracted. He went about the place wearing a hard and reckless look, utterly unlike any roughness and hardness he had shown before. The hands who had cared the least for his not altogether ill-natured tempests in days gone by shrank or were restive before him now. He drove all before him, or passed through the room sullenly. It was plain to see that he was not the man he had been, that he had even lost strength and was suddenly worn and broken, though neither flesh nor color had failed him. Among those who had made a lion of him, he was more popular than ever. The fact that he had held out against ill luck, when so many had gone down, was constantly quoted. The strikes, which had kept up an uneven but prolonged struggle, had been the ruin of many a manufacturer who had thought he could battle any storm. Haworth's had held its own and weathered the worst. This was what the county potentates were fond of saying upon all occasions, particularly when they wanted Haworth to dine with them at their houses. He used to accept their invitations, and then go and sit at their dinner tables with a sardonic face. His humor, it was remarked with some regret, was often of a sardonic kind. Occasionally he laughed at the wrong time, and his jokes were not always easy to smile under. It was also remarked that Mr. French scarcely seemed comfortable upon these festive occasions. Of late he had not been in the enjoyment of good health. He explained that he suffered from nervous headaches and depression. His refined, well-molded face had become rather thin and fatigued-looking. He had lost his effusive eloquence. He often sat silent and started nervously when spoken to. But he did not eschew society at all, always going out upon any state occasion when his partner was to be a feature of the feast. Once upon such an occasion, he had said privately, and with some plaintiveness, to Haworth, "I don't think I can go tonight, my dear fellow. I really don't feel quite equal to it." "Blast you," said Haworth, dispensing with social codes. "You'll go whether you're up to it or not. We'll keep it up to the end. It'll be over soon enough." He evinced interest in the model, in his visits to the workroom, which seemed a little singular to Murdoch. He asked questions about it, and more than once repeated his caution concerning it being kept close. "I've got it into my head that you'll finish it some of these days," he said once, "if naught happens to it or you." End of Chapter 47. Recording by John Brandon.
Chapter 48 of Haworth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jean Clare. Haworth by Frances Hodgson BURNETT. Chapter 48. Finished. One night, Murdoch, on leaving the house, said to Christian, "Don't expect me until morning. I may not be back until then. I think I shall work all night." She did not ask him why. For several days she had seen that a singular mood was upon him, that he was restless. Sometimes, when he met her eye unexpectedly, he started and colored and turned away, as if he was a little afraid. She stood upon the step and watched him until he disappeared in the darkness, and then shut the door and went in to his mother. A quarter of an hour afterward he entered his workroom and shut himself in and brought out the model. He sat looking at it a moment, and then stretched forth his hand to touch it. Suddenly he drew it back and let it fall heavily upon the table. "Good heavens!" he cried. "Did he ever feel so near as this, and then fail?" The shock was almost unbearable. "Are there to be two of us?" he said. "Was not one enough?" But he put forth his hand again a minute later, though his heart beat like a trip hammer. "It rests with me to prove it," he said, "with me." As he worked, the dead silence about him seemed to become more intense. His own breathing was a distinct sound, light as it was. The accidental dropping of a tool upon the table was a jar upon him. The tolling of the church bell at midnight was unbearable. He even took out his watch and stopped it. But at length he knew neither sound nor stillness. He forgot both. It had been a dark night, but the morning rose bright and clear. The sun, streaming in at the one window, fell upon the model, pushed far back upon the table, and on Murdoch himself, sitting with his forehead resting upon his hands. He had been sitting thus some time, he did not know how long. He had laid his last tool down before the first streak of pink had struck across the gray sky. He was tired and chill with the morning air, but he had not thought of going home yet, or even quite recognized that the night was past. His lantern still burned beside him. He was roused at last by a sound in the outer room. The gates had not been unlocked, nor the bell rung, but someone had come in. The next moment Haworth opened the door and stood on the threshold, looking in on him. "You've been here all night," he said. "Yes," answered Murdoch. He turned a little and pointed to the model, speaking slowly, as if he were but half awake. "I think," he said, "that it is complete." He said it with so little appearance of emotion or exultation that Haworth was dumbfounded. He laid a hand on his shoulder and shook him a little. "Wake up, man," he said. "You're dazed." "No," he answered, "not dazed. I've had time to think it over. It has been finished 2 or 3 hours." All at once he burst into a laugh. "I did not think," he said, "that it would be you I should tell the news to first." Haworth sat down near him with a dogged face. "Nay," he replied, "nor me either." They sat and stared at each other for a moment in silence. Then Murdoch drew a long, wearied breath. "But it is done," he said, "nevertheless." After that he got up and began to make his preparations to go home, while Haworth sat and watched him. "I shall want to go away," he said. "When I come back, I shall know what the result is to be." "Start tomorrow morning," said Haworth, "and keep close. By the time you come back—" He stopped and left his chair, and the bell which called the hands to work began its hurried clanging. At the door he paused. "When shall you take it away?" he asked. "Tonight," Murdoch answered, "after dark." At home he only told them one thing, that in the morning he was going to London and did not know when he should return. He did not go to the works during the day, but remained at home, trying to rest. But he could not sleep, and the day seemed to lag heavily. In the afternoon he left the sofa on which he had lain through the morning and went out. He walked slowly through the town and at last turned down the lane which led to the Brierleys' cottage. He felt as if there would be a sort of relief to the tenseness of his mood in a brief interview with Janey. When he went into the house, Mr. Brierley was seated in Mrs. Dixon's chair, unscientifically balancing his latest born upon his knee. His aspect was grave and absorbed. He was heated and disheveled with violent exertion. The knot of his blue cotton neckerchief had twisted itself under his right ear in a painfully suggestive manner. Under some stress of circumstances he had been suddenly pressed into service, and his mode of placating his offspring was at once unprofessional and productive of frantic excitement. But the moment he caught sight of Murdoch, an alarming change came upon him. His eyes opened to their fullest extent, his jaw fell, and the color died out of his face. He rose hurriedly, dropped the youngest Brierley into his chair, and darted out of the house, in such trepidation that his feet slipped under him when he reached the lower step, where he fell with a loud clatter of wooden clogs, scrambling up again with haste and difficulty, and disappearing at once. Attracted by the disturbance, Janey darted in from the inner room, barely in time to rescue the deserted young Brierley. "Where's he gone?" she demanded, signifying her father. "I towed her he were na fit to be trusted. Where's he gone?" "I don't know," Murdoch answered. "I think he ran away because he saw me. What is the trouble?" "Nay, dunnot ax me. We canna make him out, neither mother nor me. He's been settin' in the house for 3 days, as if he were feart to stir out. Setting by the fire and shaking his yed and crying every now and then. And here's her in the back room to wait on. A noise time this is for him to pick to go off in. He mout ha' waited till she were done with." As conversation naturally could not flourish under these circumstances, after a few minutes Murdoch took his leave. It seemed that he had not yet done with Mr. Brierley. Passing through the gate, he caught sight of a forlorn figure seated upon the roadside about 20 yards before him, wearing a fustian jacket and a blue neckcloth knotted under the ear. As he approached, Mr. Brierley looked up, keeping his eyes fixed upon him in a despairing gaze. He did not remove his glance at all, In fact, until Murdoch was within 10 feet of him, when, for some entirely inexplicable reason, he rose hurriedly and passed to the other side of the road, and at a distance of some yards ahead sat down and stared wildly at him again. This singular course he pursued until they had reached the end of the lane, where he sat and watched Murdoch out of sight. "I thought," he said, breathing with extreme shortness, "as he had done for me, it were a wonder as he did na. If I'd coom nigh him, or he'd coom nigh me, they'd ha' swore it were me as did it, and's gone according, if luck went again 'em." Then a sudden panic seemed to seize him. He pulled off his cap, and holding it in both hands, stared into it as if in desperate protest against fate. A large tear fell into the crown, and then another, and another. "I cannot help it," he said, in a loud and sepulchral whisper. "Look out! Look out!" And then, probably feeling that even in this he might be committing himself fatally, he got up, glanced fearfully about him, and scuttled away. End of chapter 48. Chapter 49 of Haworth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jean Clare. Haworth by Frances Hodgson BURNETT. Chapter 49. If Aught's for me, remember it. Before he left the house at night, Murdoch had a brief interview with his mother. "I am going to London as he went," he said, "on the same errand. The end may be what it was before. I have felt very sure, but he was sure too." "Yes," the woman answered, "he was very sure." "I don't ask you to trust it, or me," he said. "He gave a life to it. I have not given a year, and he was the better man, 1,000-fold. I," he said, with a shadow falling on his face, "have not proved myself as he did. He never faltered from the first." "No," she said. "Would to God he had." But when he went, she followed him to the door and said the words she had refused him when he had at first told her he had taken the burden upon his shoulders. "God speed you," she said. "I will try to believe." His plan was to go to his room, pack his case securely, and then carry it with him to the station in time to meet the late train he had decided on taking. He let himself into the works as usual, and found his way along the passage in the darkness, though he carried his lantern. He knew his way so well that he did not need it there. But when he reached Haworth's room and put out his hand to open the door, he stopped. His touch met no resistance, for the door was wide open. The discovery was so sharp a shock to him that for a few seconds he remained motionless. But he recovered himself in a second or so more. It might have been the result of carelessness, after all. So he turned on his light and went into his cell and began his task. It did not take him long. When he had finished, the wooden case was simply a solid square brown parcel which might have contained anything. He glanced at his watch and sat down a minute or two. "There is no use in going too early," he said, and so he waited a little, thinking mechanically of the silence inside and the darkness out, and of the journey which lay before him. But at last he got up again and took his burden by the cord he had fastened about it. "Now," he said, "it is time." At the very moment the words left his lips, there was a sound outside the door, and a rush upon him. He was seized by the throat, flung backward into the chair he had left, and held there. He made no outcry. His first thought when he found himself clutched and overpowered was an incongruous one of Brierly sitting on the roadside and looking up at him in panic-stricken appeal. He understood in a flash what his terror had meant. The fellow who held him by the collar, there were 3 of them, and one was ready, shook him roughly. "Wheer is it?" he said. "You know whatten we've coom for, my lad." Murdoch was conscious of a little chill which passed over him, but otherwise he could only wonder at his lack of excitement. No better place to finish a man than such a one as this at dead of night, and there was not one of the 3 who had not evil in his eye. But he spoke without a tremor in his voice, with the calmness of being utterly without stay or help. "Yes, I suppose I know," he said. "You came to me for it before. What are you going to do with it?" "Smash it to hell," said one concisely, "and thee, too." It was not a pleasant thing to hear by the half-light of a lantern in a place so deadly still. Murdoch felt the little chill again, but he remembered that after all he had one slender chance if he could make them listen. "You are making a blunder," he began. Reddy stopped him by addressing his comrades. "What art thou standing hearkening to him fur?" he demanded. "Smack him in the mouth and stop him." Murdoch gave a lurch forward, which it gave his captor some trouble to restrain. He turned dangerously white, and his eyes blazed. "If you do, you devil," he panted, "I'll murder you." "Where is the thing we coom fur?" said the first man, and then he caught sight of the package, which had fallen upon the floor. "Happen it's in theer," he suggested. "Open it, chaps." Then all at once Murdoch's calmness was gone. He shook in their grasp. "For God's sake," he cried, "don't touch it. Don't do it a harm. It's a mistake. It has nothing to do with your trade. It would be no hurt to you if it were known to the whole world. For God's sake, believe me." "We've heerd a different mek o' tale from that," said Redick, laughing. "It's a lie, a lie. Who told it?" "Jem Haworth," he was answered. "Jem Haworth, as it were made for." He began to struggle with all his strength. He cried out aloud and sprang up and broke loose and fought with the force of madness. "You shall pay for it," he shrieked, and 3-to-1 as they were, he held them for a moment at bay. "Get him the knob stick," cried one. "At him with it." It was Redick who aimed the blow at him, a blow that would have laid him a dead man among them, but it never fell, for he sprang forward with a mighty effort and struck the bludgeon upward, and as it fell with a crash at the opposite side of the room, they heard, even above the tumult of their struggle, a rush of heavy feet, a voice every man among them knew, and the sound they most dreaded, the sharp report of a pistol. "It's Haworth!" they shouted. "Haworth!" And they made a dash at the door in a body, stumbling over one another, striking and cursing, and the scoundrel who first got through and away was counted a lucky man. Murdoch took a step forward and fell, so close to the model that his helpless hand touched it as it lay. It was not long before he returned to consciousness. His sudden loss of strength had only been a sort of climax body and mind had reached together. When he opened his eyes again, his first thought was a wonder at himself and a vague effort to comprehend his weakness. He looked up at Haworth, who bent over him. "Lie still a bit, lad," he heard him say. "Lie and rest thee." He no sooner heard his voice than he forgot his weak wonder at himself and a stronger wonder at him. He was ashen pale, and a tremor shook him as he spoke. "Lie still and rest thee," he repeated, and he touched his head with an approach to gentleness. "They thought there was more than me," he said, "and they're not fond of powder and lead. They're better used to knobsticks and vitriol in the dark." "They meant to murder me," said Murdoch. "Aye, make sure of that. They weren't for play. They've had their minds on this for a month or two. If I'd been a minute later—" He did not finish. A queer spasm of the throat stopped him. He rose the next instant and struck a match and turned the gas on to full blaze. "Let's have light," he said. "There's a look about the place I can't stand." His eyes were bloodshot, his face looked gray and deeply lined, and his lips were parched. There was a new haggardness upon him, and he was conscious of it and tried to bear it down with his old bravado. "They'll not come back," he said. "They've had enough for tonight. If they'd known I was alone, they'd have made a stand for it. They think they were in luck to get off." He came back and sat down. "They laid their plans better than I thought," he added. "They got over me for once, devil take 'em. How art thou now, lad?" Murdoch made the effort to rise and succeeded, though he was not very strong upon his feet, and sank into a chair, feeling a little irritated at his own weakness. "Giddy," he answered, "and a trifle faint. It's a queer business. I went down as if I'd been shot. I have an hour and a half to steady myself before the next train comes in. Let me make the best of it." "You'll go tonight?" said Haworth. "There's a stronger reason than ever that I should go," he answered. "Let me get it out of the way and safe, for heaven's sake." Haworth squared his arms upon the table and leaned on them. "Then," he said, "I've got an hour and a half to make a clean breast of it." He said it almost with a swagger, and yet his voice was hoarse, and his coolness a miserable pretense. "Ask me," he said, "how I came here." And not waiting for a reply, even while Murdoch gazed at him bewildered, he answered the question himself. "I came," he said, "for a good reason. For the same reason that's brought me here every night you've been at work." Murdoch repeated his last words mechanically. He was not quite sure the man was himself. "Every night I've been at work?" "Aye, every one of 'em. There's not been a night I've not been nigh you and ready." A memory flashed across Murdoch's mind with startling force. "It was you I heard come in," he cried. "It was not fancy." "Aye, it was me." There was a moment's silence between them, in which Murdoch thought with feverish rapidity. "It was you," he said with some bitterness at last. "You who set the plot on foot?" Aye, it was me. I could have done the job I wanted to do in a quicker way, he went on after a second's pause, but that wasn't my humor. I'd a mind to keep out of it myself, and I knew how to set the chaps on as would do it in their own way. What do you mean by it? Cried Murdoch. Were you devil enough to mean to have my blood? Aye, while I was in the humor. That and worse. Murdoch sprang up and began to pace the room. His strength had come back to him with a fierce sense of repulsion which seized him. It's a blacker world than I thought, he said. We were friends once. Friends! So we were, he said hoarsely. You were the first chap I ever made friends with, and you'll be the last. It's brought no good to either of us. It might, returned Murdoch, if— Let me finish my tale, he said, even doggedly. I said to myself before I came you should hear it. I swore I'd stop at naught, and I kept my word. I sowed a seed here and there, and the soil was just right for it. They were in the mood to hearken to Aught, and they hearkened. But there came a time when I found out that things were worse with you than with me, and had gone harder with you. If you'd won where I lost, it would have been different. But you lost most of the two. You'd the most to lose, and I changed my mind. He stopped a second and looked at Murdoch, who had come back and thrown himself into his chair again. I've said many a time that you were a queer chap, he went on, as if half dubious of himself. You are a queer chap. At the start, you got a hold on me, and when I changed my mind, you got a hold on me again. I swore I'd undo what I'd done, if I could. I knew if the thing was finished and you got away with it, they'd soon find out it was naught they need fret about, so I swore to see you safe through. I gave you the keys to come here to work, and every night I came and waited until you'd done and gone away. I brought my pistols with me and kept a sharp lookout. Tonight I was late, and they'd laid their plans and got here before me. There's the beginning, and there's the end. You saved my life, said Murdoch. Let me remember that. I changed my mind and swore to undo what I'd done. There's naught for me in that, my lad, and plenty to go again me. After a little he pushed his chair back. The time's not up, he said. I've made short work of it. Pick up thy traps, and we'll go over the place together and see that it's safe. He led the way, carrying the lantern, and Murdoch followed him. They went from one end of the place to the other and found all quiet. The bars of a small lower window had been filed and wrenched out of place, Mr. Reddy and his friends having made their entrance through it. They've been on the lookout many a night before they made up their minds, said Haworth, and they chose the right place to try. Afterward they went out together, locking the door and the iron gates behind them, and went down in company to the dark little station with its dim, twinkling lights. Naturally, they did not talk very freely. Now and then there was a blank silence of many minutes between them. But at last the train thundered its way in and stopped, and there was a feeble bustle to and fro among the sleepy officials and an opening and shutting and locking of doors. When Murdoch got into his empty compartment, Haworth stood at its step. At the very last he spoke in a strange hurry. "When you come back," he said, "when you come back, perhaps—" There was a porter passing with a lantern, which struck upon his face and showed it plainly. He shrank back a moment as if he feared the light, but when it was gone, he drew near again and spoke through the window. "If there's aught in what's gone by that's for me," he said, "remember it." And with a gesture of farewell, he turned away and was gone. End of chapter 49.
Chapter 50 of Haworth's. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Haworth by Francis Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 50. An After-Dinner Speech. At dinner the next evening, Mr. French had a story to tell. It was the rather exciting story of the completion of Murdoch's labor, the night attack, and his sudden departure. Exciting as it was, however, Mr. French did not relate it in his most vivid manner. His nervous ailments had increased of late, and he was not in a condition to be vivacious and dramatic. The incident came from him rather tamely, upon the whole. "If it is the success he thinks it is," he terminated, "he is a made man, and he is not the fellow to deceive himself." "Well," he said rather drearily, "I have said it would be so." As Haworth had foreseen, St. Mirren appeared upon the scene again. He was present when the story was told, and was much interested in it as a dramatic incident, bringing the peculiarities of the manufacturing class of Broxton into strong play. If they had murdered him, he remarked with critical niceness, it would have been the most tragic of tragedies. On the very eve of his life's success. A tragedy, indeed. And it is not bad, either, that it should have been his master who saved him. Why do you say master? Said Mr. French coldly. Pardon me, I thought, Mr. French interposed in some hurry. Oh, he has always been such an uncommon young fellow that we have scarcely thought of him as a servant. He has not been exactly a servant, in fact. Ah, replied St. Maron, I ask pardon again. He had not been a little bewildered at the change he found in the household. Mr. French no longer expounded his views at length with refined vigor. He frequently excused himself from the family circle on plea of severe indisposition, and at other times he sat in singular and depressing silence. He was evidently ill. There were lines upon his forehead and circles about his eyes. He had a perturbed air, and started without any apparent cause. A change showed itself in Miss French also, so subtle as not to be easily described. It was a change which was not pallor nor fragility. It was an alteration which baffled him, and yet forced him to recognize its presence constantly, and to endeavor to comprehend it. French himself had seen it, and pondered over it in secret. When he sat in his private room at the bank, bewildered and terrified, even by the mere effort to think and face the future, his burden was not a little increased by his remembrance of his hours at home. More than all the rest, he shrank from the day of reckoning with his daughter. He had confronted Haworth, and borne the worst of his wrath. The account of himself which he must render to her would be the most scathing ordeal of his life. Some women would pity me, he said to himself, but she will not. Truth to tell, he looked forward pathetically to the possibility that hereafter their paths might lie apart. Fate had saved him one fearful responsibility at least. Her private fortune had been beyond his reach, and she would still be a rich woman even when the worst came. He could live on very little, he told himself, and there was always some hope for a man of resources. He still believed somewhat, though rather vaguely, in his resources. A few days after Murdoch's departure, there came to Broxton, on a visit of inspection, a dignitary of great magnitude, a political economist, a member of Parliament. Above all other things, he was absorbed in the fortunes of the manufacturing districts. He had done the trades unions the honor of weighing their cause and reasoning with them. He had parleyed with the strikers, and held meetings with the masters. He had heard of Haworth and his extraordinary stand against the outbreak, and was curious to see him. He came as the guest of one of the county families, who regarded Haworth and his success a subject worth enlarging upon. He was taken to the works and presented to their master. Haworth met him with little enthusiasm. He showed him over the place, but maintained his taciturnity. He was not even moved to any exhibition of gratitude on being told that he had done wonders. The finale of the visit was a stately dinner given by the county family. Haworth and the member were the features of the festivity, and speeches were made which took a congratulatory and even a laudatory turn. "I can't go," French cried, piteously, when Haworth came to his room at the bank with the news. He turned quite white, and sank back into his chair. "It is too much to ask. No, I am not strong enough." He felt himself as good as a dead man when Haworth turned about and strode up to him, livid, and opening and shutting his hands. "Blast you!" he hissed through his teeth. You did it, you, and you shall pay for it as long as I'm nigh to make you." St. Mirren was among the guests, and Miss French, whose wonderful beauty attracted the dignitary's eye at once. Years after, he remembered and spoke of her. He glanced toward her when he rose to make his after-dinner speech and caught her eye, and was somewhat confused by it. But he was very eloquent. The master of Haworth's was his inspiration and text. His resources, his strength of will, his giant enterprises, his readiness and daring at the moment when all was at hazard, these were matters, indeed, for eloquence. Haworth sat leaning forward upon the table. He played with his wine-glass, turning it round and round, not spilling a drop of the ruby liquid. Sometimes he glanced at the orator with a smile, which no one exactly understood. Oftener, he kept his eyes fixed upon the full wine-glass. When at length the speaker sat down with a swift final glance at Rachel French, there was a silence of several seconds. Everybody felt that a reply was needed. Haworth turned his wine-glass 2 or 3 times without raising his eyes, but at last, just as the pause was becoming embarrassing, he looked across the table at French, who sat opposite. "I'm not a speech-making chap myself," he said. "My partner is. He'll say my say for me." He gave French a nod. That gentleman had been pale and distracted through all the courses. Now he became paler than ever. He hesitated, glanced about him, at the waiting guest, and at Haworth, who nodded again, and then rose. It was something unusual that Mr. French should hang back and show himself unready. He began his speech of thanks in his partner's name falteringly, and as if at a loss for the commonest forms of expression. He replied to the members' compliments with hesitation. He spoke of the difficulties they had encountered with a visibly strong effort. He touched upon their success and triumph with such singular lack of exultation that those who listened began to exchange looks of questioning, and suddenly, in the midst of his wanderings and struggles at recovering himself, he broke off and begged leave to sit down. "I am ill," he said. "I have been indisposed for some time. I must crave your pardon and my partner's for my inability to say what I would wish." He sat down amid many expressions of sympathy. The plea accounted for his unusual demeanor, it was thought. The member himself sought an interview with him, in which he expressed his regret and his sense of the fact that nothing was more natural than that the result of so long bearing a weight of responsibility should be a strain upon the nervous system and a consequent loss of physical strength. "You must care for yourself, my dear sir," he added. "Your firm, nay, the country, cannot afford to lose an element like yourself at such a crisis." On the morning following, the member left Broxton. On his way to the station, he was moved to pay a final visit to Haworth at the works. "I congratulate you," he said, with much warmth, on shaking hands with him. "I congratulate England upon your determination and indomitable courage, and upon your wonderful success." There was a good deal of talk about Murdoch during his absence. The story of the attack and of Haworth's repulse of the attacking party became a popular incident. Mr. Reddie and his companions disappeared from the scene with promptness. Much interest was manifested in the ultimate success of the model, which had previously been regarded with the mingling of indifference and disfavor, as not like to come to Aught. The results of its agreeably disappointing people by coming to Aught were estimated at nothing short of $1 million per annum. "The chapel roll i' brass," it was said. "Haworth will be new weir. Happen the lad'll come back and set up a works agin 'em. And he come here nowt but a working chap, a few years sin. The two women in the little house in the narrow street heard the story of the attack only through report. They had no letters. "I won't write," Murdoch had said. "You shall not be troubled by prospects that might end in nothing. You will hear nothing from me till I come and tell you with my own lips that I have won or failed." In the days of waiting, Christian proved her strength. She would not let her belief be beaten or weighed down. She clung to it, in spite of what she saw, hour by hour, in the face of the woman who was her companion. "I have lived through it before." It was not put into words, but she read it in her eyes and believed in spite of it. He had been away 2 weeks, and he returned as his father had done, at night. The women were sitting together in the little room. They were not talking or working, though each had work in her hands. It was Christian who heard him first. She threw down her work and stood up. "He is here!" she cried. "He is coming up the step!" She was out in the narrow entry and had thrown the door open before he had time to open it with his key. The light fell upon his dark, pale face and showed a strange excitement in it. He was disheveled and travel-worn, but his eyes were bright. His first words were enough. "It is all right," he said, in an exultant voice. "It is a success. Where is my mother?" He had taken her hand as if without knowing what he did, and fairly dragged her into the room. His mother had risen and stood waiting. "It is a success," he cried out to her. "It is what he meant it to be. I have finished his work." She turned from him to the girl, uttering a low cry of appeal. "Christian," she said, "Christian." The girl went to her and made her sit down, and knelt before her, clasping her arms about her waist, and uplifting her glowing young face. At the moment her beauty became such a splendor that Murdoch himself saw it with wonder. "It is finished," she said, "and it is he who has finished it. Is not that enough?" "Yes," she answered, but, and the words died upon her lips, and she sat looking before her into vacancy and trembling. Murdoch threw himself on the sofa and lay there, his hands clasped above his head. "I shall be a rich man," he said, as if to himself, "a rich man, and it is nothing, but it is done." End of chapter 50. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 51 of Haworth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Haworths by Francis Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 51. Only one as is, nay a fool. The next day all Broxton knew the story. Well, he were nae so soft after all, more than one excellent matron remarked. Mr. French heard the news from his valet in the morning. He had been very unwell for several days. He had eaten nothing and slept very little, and had been obliged to call in his physician, who pronounced his case the result of too great mental strain, and prescribed rest. He came down to breakfast with an unwholesome face, and trifled with his food without eating it. He glanced furtively at Rachel again and again. "I shall not go to the bank today," he said timorously at last. "I am worse than ever. I shall remain at home and try to write letters and rest. Are you going out?" "Yes," she answered. "Oh?" Then, after a pause, he said, "I saw Brierly yesterday, and he said Mrs. Dixon was very ill. You sometimes go there, I believe?" "Yes." Suppose you call this morning to inquire. It looks well to show a sort of interest in them. You might take something nourishing with you." He flinched when she raised her eyes and let them rest a moment upon him. Her look was strongly suggestive of the fact that she could better rely upon the result of her own calculations concerning him than upon the truth of his replies, if she deigned to ask him questions. "I thought," he faltered, "that it would look well to evince some interest, as the man has been in our employ, and you have had the woman about the house." "Certainly," she replied. "It would be well enough. I will go." After breakfast, she ordered the carriage, and went to her room and made her toilet with some care. Why she did so was best known to herself. Nothing is more certain than that she scarcely expected to produce a great effect upon Granny Dickson. The truth was, she would have made her visit to the Brierleys in any case, and was not in the least moved thereto by her father's unexpected anxiety. But when she reached the cottage and entered it, she began immediately to repent having come. A neighbor woman sat nursing the youngest Brierly. There was a peculiar hush upon the house, and the windows were darkened. She drew back with a feeling of alarm and annoyance. "What is the matter?" she demanded impatiently of the woman. "Why have you darkened the room?" "The old lass is deein'," was the businesslike answer, "and they're haeing some trouble wi' her. She canna even de loike o' their folk." She drew back, her annoyance becoming violent repulsion. She turned pale, and her heart began to beat violently. She knew nothing of death, and was not fearless of it. Her inveterate calm failed her in thus being brought near it. "I will go away," she said. And she would have gone, but at that moment there arose a sound of voices in the inner room, Mrs. Brierly's and Janey's, and above theirs Granny Dickson's, brokenly, and yet with what seemed terrible loudness in the hush of the house. "Bring her here," she was saying. "Bring her here, and make her do it." And then came out Mrs. Brierly, looking fagged and harassed. "I ax thy pardon, miss," she said, "but she says she wants thee. She says she wants thee to be a witness to summat." "I will not go," she replied. I am going away. I never saw anyone before in that condition." But the terrible voice raised itself again, and despite her terror and anger, held and controlled her. "I see her," it cried. "Make her come in. I knowed her grandfeyther when I were a lass 70 years ago." "She will nae harm thee," said Mrs. Brierly, and partly because of a dread fascination, and partly because the two women regarded her with such amazement, she found herself forced to give way and enter. It was a small room, and dark and low. The bed was a huge four-poster, which had belonged to Granny Dickson herself in her young days. The large flowered patterns of its chintz hangings were faded with many washings. Of the woman lying upon it, there was little left but skin and bone. She seemed all eyes and voice, eyes which stared and shone in the gloom, and voice which broke upon the silence with an awesome power. "She's been speaking almost i' a whisper till to-day," explained Mrs. Brierly under her breath, "and a' at onct the change set in, and it coom back as loud as iver." She lifted her hands, beckoning with crooked fingers. "Come thou here," she commanded. Rachel French went to her slowly. She had no color left, and all her hauteur could not steady her voice. "What do you want?" she asked, standing close beside the bed. For a few seconds there was silence, in which the large eyes wandered from the border of her rich dress to the crown of her hair. Then Granny Dickson spoke out. "Where'st flour?" she cried. "That's getting it on thee again. I can smell it." It was true that she wore it at her throat as she had done before. A panic of disgust took possession of her as she recollected it. It was as if they two were somehow bound together by it. She caught at it with tremulous fingers and would have flung it away, but it fell from her uncertain clasp upon the bed, and she would not have touched it for worlds. "Gie it to me," commanded Granny Dickson. "Pick it up for her," she said, turning to Mrs. Brierly, and it was done, and the shriveled fingers held it, and the old eye devoured it. "He used to wear 'em in his buttonhole," proclaimed the voice, "and he were a handsome chap 70 years ago." "Did you send for me to tell me that?" demanded Rachel French. Granny Dickson turned on her pile of pillows. "Nay," she said, "an' I'm forgettin'." There was a gasp between the two last words, as if suddenly her strength was failing her. "Get thee a pen, and write summat," she ordered. "Get it quickly," said Rachel French, "and let me humour her and go." She noticed the little gap between the words herself, and the next instant saw a faint gray pallor spread itself over the old woman's face. "Get the pen and paper," she repeated, "and call in the woman." They brought her the pen and paper and called the woman, who came in stolidly, ready for any emergency. Then they waited for commands. But for several seconds there was a dead pause, and Granny Dickson lay back, staring straight before her. "Quick," said Rachel French. "What do you want?" Granny Dickson rose by a great effort upright from her pillows. She pointed to Mrs. Brierly with a sharp, bony forefinger. "I leave it all to her," she proclaimed. "Every penny. She's the only one among 'em as is nae a fool." And then she fell back and panted and stared again. Mrs. Brierly lifted her apron and burst into tears. "She means the brass," she wailed. "Eh, poor old lass. Who'd ha' thought it?" "Do you mean," asked Rachel French, "that you wish her to have your money?" A nod was the answer, and Mrs. Brierly shed sympathetic tears again. Here was a reward for her labors indeed. What she wrote, Miss French scarcely knew. In the end there was her own name signed below, and a black scrawling mark from Granny Dickson's hand. The woman who had come in made her mark also. "Make a black un," said the testatrix. "Let's hae it plain." Then turning to Rachel, "Does to want to know where the money come from?" "Fro Will French, fro him. He war one o' the gentry when all were said and done, and I were a handsome lass." When it was done, they all stood and looked at each other. Granny Dickson lay back upon her pillows, drawing sharp breaths. She was looking only at Rachel French. She seemed to have forgotten all the rest of them, and what she had been doing. All that was left of the voice was a loud, halting whisper. "Where's the flour?" she said. "I cannot smell it." It was in her hand. Rachel French drew back. "Let me go," she said to Mrs. Brierly, I cannot stay here." He used to wear 'em in his buttonhole, she heard, 70 years ago. And she's the very moral on him. And scarcely knowing how, she made her way past the women and out of the house and into the fresh air and sunshine. "Drive home," she said to the coachman, "as quickly as possible." She leaned back in the corner of the carriage, shuddering. Suddenly she burst into wild tears. But there were no traces of her excitement when she reached home. She descended from the carriage looking quite herself, and after dismissing it, went up to her own room. About half an hour later she came down and went into the library. Her father was not there, and on inquiring as to his whereabouts from a servant passing the open door, she was told that he had gone out. He had been writing letters, it was evident. His chair stood before his desk, and there was an addressed envelope lying upon it. She went to the desk and glanced at it without any special motive for doing so. It was addressed to herself. She opened and read it. "My dear Rachel," it ran, "in all probability we shall not meet again for some time. I find myself utterly unable to remain to meet the blow which must inevitably fall before many days are over. The anxiety of the past year has made me a coward. I ask your forgiveness for what you may call my desertion of you. We have never relied upon each other much, and you at least are not included in my ruin. You will not be called upon to share my poverty. You had better return to Paris at once. With a faint hope that you will at least pity me, I remain your affectionate father, Gerard French." End of Chapter 51. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 52 of Haworth's. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Haworth by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 52. Haworth is done with. Almost at the same moment, Haworth was reading, in his room at the works, the letter which had been left for himself. "I have borne as much as I can bear," it ended. "My punishment for my folly is that I am a ruined man and a fugitive. My presence upon the scene, when the climax comes, would be of no benefit to either of us. Pardon me, if you can, for the wrong I have unintentionally done you. My ill luck was surely the result of circumstances. Even yet, I cannot help thinking that there were great possibilities in my plans. But you will not believe this, and I will say no more. In haste, French." When Rachel French finished reading her note, she lighted a taper and held the paper to it until it was reduced to ashes, and afterward turned away, merely a shade paler and colder than before. Haworth, having finished the reading of French's letter, sat for a few seconds staring down at it as it lay before him on the table. Then he burst into a brutal laugh. After that he sat stupefied, his elbows on the table, his head on his hands. He did not move for half an hour. The work saw very little of him during the day. He remained alone in his room, not showing himself, and one of the head clerks, coming in from the bank on business, went back mystified, and remarked in confidence to a companion that things had a queer look. He did not leave the works until late, and then went home. All through the evening his mother watched him in her old tender way. She tried to interest him with her history of the Brierleys' bereavement and unexpected good fortune. She shed tears over her recital. "So old, my dear," she said, "old enough to have outlived her own, and her ways a little hard," wiping her eyes. "I'd like to be grieved for more, Jem, though perhaps it's only natural as it should be so. She hadn't no son to miss her, as you'll miss me. I shouldn't like to be the last, Jem." He had been listening mechanically, and he started and turned to her. "The last?" he said. "Aye, it's a bit hard." It was as if she had suggested a new thought to him of which he could not rid himself at once. He kept looking at her, his eyes wandering over her frail little figure and innocent old face, restlessly. "But I haven't no fear," she went on, "though we never know what's to come. But you're a strong man, and there's not like to be many more years for me, though I'm so well and happy." "You might live a score," he answered in an abstracted way, his eyes still fixed on her. "Not without you," she returned. "It's you that's life to me, and strength and peace." The innocent tears were in her voice again, and her eyes were bright with them. He lay down a while, but could not lie still. He got up and came and stood near her, and talked, and then moved here and there, picking up one thing and another, holding them idly for a few seconds, and then setting them aside. At last she was going to bed, and came to bid him good night. He laid his hand on her shoulder caressingly. "There's never been aught like trouble between us two," he said. "I've been a quiet enough chap, and different somehow, when I've been nigh you. What I've done for your sake and for the best." In the morning the works were closed, the doors of the bank remained unopened, and the news spread like wildfire from house to house and from street to street, and beyond the limits of the town, until before noon it was known through the whole countryside that French had fled and Jem Haworth was a ruined man. It reached the public ear in the first instance in the ordinary commonplace manner, through the individuals who had suddenly descended upon the place to take possession. A great crowd gathered about the closed gates and murmured and stared and anathemized. "There's been summat up for mony a month," said one sage. "I've seed it. He war na hisson, war na Haworth." "Nay," said another, "that he war na. The chap has na been o' decent spree sin French come." "Happen," added a third, "that war what started him on the road downhill. A chap is na good for much as has na regular habits." "Aye, and Haworth were regular now when he set up." "Good Lord, who'd ha' thought o' that chappy bankruptcy?" At the outset, the feeling manifested was not unamiable to Haworth, but it was not very long before the closing of the bank dawned upon the public in a new light. It meant loss and ruin. The first man who roused the tumult was a burly farmer, who dashed into the town on a sweating horse, spurring it as he rode, and wearing a red and furious face. He left his horse at an inn, and came down to the bank, booted and spurred and whip in hand. "Where's French?" he shouted to the smaller crowd attracted there, and whose views as in the ultimate settlement of things were extremely vague. "Where's French, and where's Haworth?" Half a dozen voices volunteered information regarding French, but no one knew anything of Haworth. He might be in a dozen places, but no one had yet seen him or heard of his whereabouts. The man began to push his way toward the building, swearing hotly. He mounted the steps and struck violently on the door with his whip. "I'll make in here if he shut his in there," he cried. The shifty villains got every shillin' of brass I've been saving for my little wench for the last 10 year. I'll hae it back, if it's to be gotten." "They'll ne'er see it again," shouted a voice in the crowd. "That's better hae stucken thou'd stockin', lad." Then the uproar began. One luckless depositor after another was added to the crowd. They might easily be known among the rest by their pale faces. Some of them were stunned into silence, but the greater portion of them were loud and passionate in their outcry. A few women hung on the outskirts, wiping their eyes every now and then with their aprons, and sometimes bursting into audible fits of weeping. "I've been going out charing for 4 year," said one, "to buy silks and satins for the gentry. You never seed her in aught else." And all knew whom she meant, and joined in shouts of rage. Sometimes it was French against whom their anger was most violent. French who had been born among them a gentleman, and who should have been gentleman enough not to plunder and deceive them. And again it was Haworth who had lived as hard as any of them, and knew what their poverty was, and should have done fairly by them, if ever man should. In the course of the afternoon, Murdoch, gathering no news of Haworth elsewhere, went to his house. A panic-stricken servant let him in, and led him into the great room where he had spent his first evening, long ago. Despite its splendor, it looked empty and lifeless. But when he entered, there rose from a carved and satin-upholstered chair in one corner a little old figure in a black dress. Jem Haworth's mother, who came to him with a white but calm face. "Sir," were her greeting words, "where is he?" "I came to see him," he answered. "I thought—" "No," she interrupted. "He's not here. He's not been here since morning." She began to tremble, but shed no tears. "There's been a good many to ask for him," she went on. "Gentlemen, and them as was rough and didn't mind me being a woman and old. They were harder than you'd think, and troubled as I've been. I was glad he was not here to see 'em. But I'd be more comfortable if I could rightly understand. I can only tell you what I know," he said. "It isn't much. I've only gathered it from people on the streets." He led her back to her chair and did not loosen his light grasp on her hand while he told her the story as he had heard it. His own mood was so subdued that it was easier than he had thought to use words which would lighten the first weight of the blow. She asked no questions after his explanation was over. "He's a poor man," she said at last, "a poor man, but we was poor before." Suddenly her tears burst forth. "They've said hard things to me today," she cried. "I don't believe 'em, Jem, my dear, now less than ever." He comforted her as best he could. He could easily understand what they had told her, how much of the truth and how much of angry falsehood. "When he comes back," she said, "I shall be here to meet him, wherever he is, and however much he's broke down with trouble. He knows that. He'll come here tonight, and I shall be here." Before he went away, he asked if he might send Christian or his mother to her. But though she thanked him, she refused. "I know how good they'd be," she said, "and what a comfort in the lonesomeness. But when he comes, he'll want to be alone, and an unfamiliar face might trouble him." But he did not come back. The day went on, and the excitement increased and waned by turns. The crowd grew and surged about the bank and shouted itself hoarse, and would have broken a few windows if it had not been restrained by the police force, who appeared upon the field, and there were yells for Haworth and for French. But by this time Mr. French had reached Rotterdam, and Haworth was no one knew where, since he had not been seen at all. And when at length dusk fell upon the town, the crowd had dwindled away and gone home by ones and twos, and in Jem Haworth's house sat his mother, watching and waiting and straining her ears to catch every passing sound. She had kept up her courage bravely through the first part of the day, but the strangers who came one after the other, and sometimes even two or three together, to demand her son, with loud words and denunciations and even threats, were a sore trial to her. Some of them flung their evil stories at her without remorse, taking it for granted that they were nothing new to her ears, and even those who had some compunction muttered among themselves and hinted angrily at what the others spoke outright. Her strength began to give way, and she quailed and trembled before them, but she never let their words pass without a desperate effort to defend her boy. Then they stared and laughed at her, and went away in sullen silence, and she was left to struggle with her grief and terror alone until some new call was made upon her, and she must bear all again. When the twilight came, she was still alone, and sat in the darkened room battling against a dread which had crept slowly upon her. Of all those who had come, none had known where he was. They did not know in the town, and he had not come back. "He might go," she whispered, "but he'd not go without me. He's been true and fond of his mother. Let them say what they will. He'd never leave me here alone." Her thoughts went back over the years, from his birth to the day of his highest success. She remembered how he had fought with fate and made his way and refused to be conquered. She thought of the wealth he had won, the power, the popularity, and of his boast that he had never been beaten, and she began to sob in the shadow of her corner. "He's lost it all," she cried, "and he won it with his own hands, and worked for it, and bore up again a world, and it's gone." It was when she came to this point that her terror seized on her, as it had never done before. She got up, shaking in every limb. "I'll go to him myself," she said. "Who should go to him but his mother? Who should find him and be a help to him if I can't? Jem, Jem, my dear, it's me that's coming to you. Me." He had been sitting in a small back office in the bank all through the day, when they had been calling and searching for him. He had got in early and locked the door and waited, knowing well enough all that was to come. It was no feeling of fear that made him keep hidden. He had done with fear, if indeed he had ever felt it in his life. He knew what he was going to do, and he laid his plans coolly. He was to stay here and do the work that lay before him and leave things as straight as he could, and then at night, when all was quiet, he would make his way out in the dark and go to the works. It was only a fancy, this, of going to the works, but he clung to it persistently. He had never been clearer-headed in his life, only sometimes, as he was making a calculation or writing a letter, he would dash down his work and fall to cursing. "There's not another chap in England that had done it," he would say, "and it's gone, it's gone, it's gone." Then again he would break into a short laugh, remembering the MP and his speech, and poor French's stumbling, overwhelmed reply to it. When he heard the crowd shouting and hooting at the front, he went into a room facing the street and watched them through a chink in the shutter. He heard the red-faced farmers' anathemas, and swore a little himself, knowing his story was true. "That shall have all Haworth can give, chaps," he muttered. "And welcome. He'll take nowt with him." He laughed again, but suddenly stopped, and walked back into the little office silently and waited there. At nightfall he went out of a back door and slipped through unfrequented byways, feeling his heart beat with heavy thuds as he went. Nothing stood in his way, and he got in, as he believed he should. The instant his foot crossed the threshold, a change came upon him. He forgot all else but what lay before him. He was less calm, and in some little hurry. He reached his room and lighted the gas dimly, only so that he could see to move about. Then he went to his desk and opened it, and took out one of a pair of pistols, speaking aloud as he did so. "Here," he said, "is the end of Jem Haworth." He knew where to aim. The heavy thuds marked the spot for him. "I'll count 3, he said, "and then—" He began slowly, steadily, but in a voice that fell with a hollow sound upon the dead stillness. 1, he said. 2, and his hand dropped at his side with his weapon in it, for at the door stood his mother. In an instant she had fallen upon her knees and dragged herself toward him and was clinging to his hand. "No, Jem," she panted. "No, not that, my dear. God forbid!" He staggered back, though she still clung to him. "How?" he faltered. "How did you come here?" "The Lord led me," she sobbed. "He put it into my heart and showed me the way. And you had forgot the door, Jem, thank God." "You saw what I was going to do?" "What you was going to do. But what you'll never do, Jem. And me to live and suffer when it's done? Me as you've been so good and such a comfort to." In the dim light she knelt sobbing at his feet. "Let me sit down," he said, "and sit down nigh me. I've summat to tell you." But though he sank into the chair, she could not get up, but kept her place in spite of him and went on. "Today there have been black tales told you?" he said. "Yes," she cried, but "They're true," he said, "the worst on 'em." "No, no." He stopped her by going on monotonously, as if she had not spoken. "Think of the worst you've ever known. You've not known much. And then say to yourself, 'He's worse 100 times.' Think of the blackest you've ever known to be done. And then say to yourself, what he's done's blacker yet. If any chap has told you I've stood at naught until there was next to naught I'd left undone, he spoke true. If there was any one told you I set the decent ones by the ears and laughed 'em in the face, he spoke true. If any of 'em said I was a dread and a byword, they spoke true, too. The night you came, there were men and women in the house that couldn't look you in the face, and that felt shame for the first time in their lives, mayhap, because you didn't know what they were, and took them to be as innocent as yourself. There's not a sin I haven't tasted, nor a wrong I've not done. I've had murder in my mind, and planned it. I've been mad for a woman not worth even what Jem Haworth had to give her. And I've won all I'd swore I'd win, and lost it. Now tell me if there's aught else to do but what I've set my mind on." She clung to his heavy hand, as she had not clung to it before, and laid her withered cheek upon it and kissed it. Bruised and crushed as she was with the blows he had dealt, she would not let it go free yet. Her words came from her lips, a broken cry, with piteous sobs between them. But she had her answer ready. That, as I've thanked God for all my life, she said, He'll surely give me in the end. He couldn't hold it back. I've so believed and been grateful to Him. If there hadn't been in you what would make a good man, my dear, I couldn't have been so deceived and so happy. No, not deceived, that ain't the word, Jem. The good was there. You lived 2 lives, maybe. But one was good, thank God. You've been a good son to me. You've never hurt me, and it was your love as hid from me the wrong you did. You did love me, Jem. I won't give that up. Never. There's nothing you've done as can stand agin that, with her as in your mother. You loved me, and was my own son, my boy, as was a comfort and a pride to me from the first. He watched her with a stunned look. You didn't believe them? He said hoarsely. And you don't believe me? She put her hand to her heart and almost smiled. It hasn't come home to me yet, she said. I don't think it ever will. He looked helplessly toward the pistol on the table. He knew it was all over, and he should not use it. What must I do? He said in the same hoarse voice. Get up, she said, and come with me. I'm an old woman, but my heart's strong, and we've been poor before. We'll go away together and leave it all behind. All the sorrow of it, and the sin, and the shame. The life I thought you lived, my dear, is to be lived yet. There's places where they won't know us, and where we can begin again. Get up and come with me. He scarcely grasped what she meant. With you? He repeated. You want me to go now? Yes, she answered. For Christ's sake, my dear, now. He began to see the meaning and possibility of her simple woman's plan and got up, ready to follow her. And then he found that the want of food and the long day had worn upon him so that he was weak. She put her arm beneath his and tried to support him. Lean on me, my dear, she said. I'm stronger than you think. They went out, leaving the empty room and the pistol on the table and the dim light burning. And then they locked the gate and were outside with a few stars shining above and the great black works looming up before them. He stopped a moment to look back and up and remembered the key. Suddenly he raised it in his hand and flung it across the top of the locked gate. They heard it fall inside upon the pavement with a clang. They'll wonder how it came there, he said. They'll take down the name tomorrow. Haworth's is done with. He turned to her and said, Come. His voice was a little stronger. They went down the lane together and were lost in the darkness. End of chapter 52. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 53 of Haworth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Haworth by Francis Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 53. A Bit of Good Black. Granny Dixon was interred with pomp and ceremony, or at least with what appeared pomp and ceremony in the eyes of the lower social stratum of Broxton. Mrs. Brierly's idea concerning the legacy left her had been of the vaguest. Her revered relative had shrewdly kept the amount of her possessions strictly to herself, if indeed she knew definitely what they were. She had spent but little, discreetly living upon the expectations of her kindred. She had never been known to give anybody anything, and had dealt out the money to be expended upon her own wants with a close hand. Consequently, the principal, which had been a mystery from the first, had accumulated in an agreeably steady manner. Between her periodic fits of weeping in her character of sole legatee, Mrs. Brierly speculated with matronly prudence upon the possibility of the interest even amounting to a matter of 10 or 15 shillings a week, and found the pangs of bereavement materially softened thereby. There was a great deal of consolation to be derived from 10 or 15 shillings a week. "I'll hae a bit of good black," she said, "and we'll gie her a nice burying." Only a severe sense of duty to the deceased rescued her from tempering her mournfulness with an air of modest cheer. The bit of good black was the first investment. There was a gown remarkable for such stiffness of lining and a tendency to crackle upon every movement of the wearer, and there was a shawl of great weight and size, and a bonnet which was a marvel of unmitigated affliction, as expressed by floral decorations of black crape and beads. "Have thee beads in thy bonnet, and a pair of black gloves, mother," said Janey, "and that'll be dressed up for once in thy life." "Eh, but I'd like to go a morning, my son." "Aye, and so thou should, Jane Ann, if I could afford it," replied Mrs. Brierly. "There's nowt like a bit of black for making folk look dressed. There's summat cheerful about it, i' a quiet way. But never thee mind. That'll get thee hear things o' mine when I'm done wi' 'em, and happen that'll ha' growed up to fit the bonnet by then." The occasion of the putting on of the festive garb was Mrs. Brierly's visit to Manchester to examine into the state of her relatives' affairs, and such was the effect produced upon the mind of Mr. Brierly by the air of high life surrounding him, that he retired into the late Mrs. Dixon's chair and wept copiously. "I niver thought to see thee dressed up in so much luxury, Sarah Ann," he said, "and it sets me back. Thou does not look like thysen. Thou looks as though thou might be one of the nobility, going to the Duke of Wellington's funeral to ride behind the horse. I'm not worthy of thee. I never brought thee luck. I'm a misfortunate cha." "If thou'd shut thy mouth and keep it shut till someone axes thee to open it, that'd do well enow," interposed Mrs. Brierly, with a manifest weakening toward the culprit, even in the midst of her sternness. "He's nae so bad," she used to say leniently, "if he hae not been born a fool." But this recalled to Mr. Brierly such memories as only plunged him into deeper depression. "There is nae many as axes me to open it these days, Sarah Ann," he said with mournfulness. "It has nae opened to mich purpose for mony a day. Even the hospity blessed on 'em gets toward o' a chap as sees nowt but misfortune. I mout as well turn teetotal and get thee credit on it. Happen there's a bit of pleasure to be gotten out of staggerin' through the streets wi' a banner i' the Whitweek possession. I do not know. I thought, my son, as happen the tea a chap has to drink when the excitement's o'er, and the speeches would a'most be a drawback even to that. But I mun say I thought o' tryin'." It may be here remarked that since Mrs. Brierly's sudden accession to fortune, Mr. Brierly's manner had been that of a humble and sincere penitent whose sympathies were slowly but surely verging toward the noble cause of temperance. He had repeatedly deplored his wanderings from the path of sobriety and rectitude, with tearful though subdued eloquence, and frequently intimated a mournful inclination to join the teetotals. Though strange to say, the effect of these sincere manifestations had not been such as to restore in the partner of his joys and sorrows that unlimited confidence which would allow of her confiding to his care the small amount he had once or twice feebly suggested her favoring him with. "To settle we, a violent and not to be pacified creditor, of whom he stated he stood in bodily fear. "I do not know as I ever seed a chap as were as disparate or a little," he remarked. "It is nae but 18 pence, and he says he'll hae it, or see about it. He stands at the street corner, near the Who'da Thought It, and he will nae listen to aught. He says a chap as come into property can pay 18 pence. He would not believe me," he added weakly, "when I say as it is nae me as has getten the brass, but you. It makes him worse to try to make him understand. He will nae believe me, and he's a chap as would nae stand back it out. There were a man in Marfort as owed him 3 pence as he mashed into a jelly, Sarah Ann, and it were for 3 pence. "Aye," said Mrs. Brierly dryly, "and there's no knowing what he'd do for 18 pence. There's a bad lookout for thee, sure now." Mr. Brierly paused and surveyed her for a few seconds in painful silence. Then he looked at the floor, as if appealing to it for assistance. But even here he met with indifference, and his wounded spirit sought relief in meek protestations. "They has no confidence in me, Sarah Ann," he said. "Happen the teetotals would nae ha neither. Happen they wouldn't, and where's the use o' a chap thinking o' jinin' 'em, when they moat hae no confidence in him? When a man's family mistrusts him, and has no belief in what he says, he canna help feelin' as he is nae encouraged. That is nae encouragin', Sarah Ann. There's where it is." But when, after her visit to Manchester, Mrs. Brierly returned, even Mr. Brierly's spirits rose, though under stress of circumstances and in private. On entering the house, Mrs. Brierly sank into a chair, breathless and overawed. "It's £2.10 a week, Janie," she announced in a hysterical voice, "and tha can ha' thy black as soon as tha wants it." And Mrs. Brierly burst at once into luxurious weeping. Janie dropped onto a stool, rolled her arms under her apron, and sat gasping. £2.10 a week!" she exclaimed. "I do not believe it." But she was persuaded to believe it by means of soundproof and solid argument, and even the properties were scarcely sufficient to tone down the prevailing emotion. "There's a good deal to be gettin' wi' £2.10 a week," soliloquized Mr. Brierly in his corner. "I've heerd o' heads o' families as were 'lowanced. Summat could be done wi' 3 shillin' a week. Wi' 4 shillin' a chap could be in paradise." But this, be it observed, was merely soliloquy, timorously ventured upon in the temporary security afforded by the prevailing excitement. At the funeral the whole family appeared, clothed in new garments of the most sombre description. There were 3 black coaches, and Mrs. Brierly was supported by numerous friends, who alternately cheered and condoled with her. "The mum, remember," they said, "as she's better off, poor thing." Mr. Brierly, who had been adorned with a hatband of appalling width and length, and had been furthermore inserted into a pair of gloves some inches too long in the fingers, overcame his emotion at this juncture sufficiently to make an endeavor to ingratiate himself. He withdrew his handkerchief from his face and addressed Mrs. Brierly. "Aye," he said, "the mun bear up, Sarah Ann. She is better off, happen, and so are we." And he glanced round with a faint smile, which, however, faded out with singular rapidity, and left him looking somewhat aghast. End of chapter 53. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 54 of Haworth's. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Haworth's by Francis Hodgson BURNETT. Chapter 54. It Will Be to You. They found the key lying within the locked gate, and the dim light burning, and the pistol loaded upon the table. The great house stood empty, with all its grandeur intact. The servants had been paid their wages a few days before the crash, and had gone away. Nothing had been moved, nothing taken. The creditors had found to their amazement that all was left in their hands to dispose of as they chose, agreed that this was not an orthodox case of absconding. Haworth was a more eccentric fellow than they had thought. One man alone understood. This was Murdoch, who amid all the buzz of excited amazement said nothing even to those in his own house. When he heard the story of the pistol and the key, his first thought was of the silence of the great place at night, the deadness of it, and the sense of desolation it brought. It was a terrible thing to remember this, and then picture a ruined man, standing alone in the midst of it, a pistol in his hand, and only the low light burning. We did not understand each other very well, he said, drearily, but we were friends in our own way. And the man's farewell, as he stood at the carriage door in the shadow, came back to him again and again, like an echo repeating itself. If there's aught in what's gone by, that's for me, remember it. Even before his return home, Murdoch had made up his mind as to what his course for the next few years was to be. His future was assured, and he might follow his idlest fancy. But his fancies were not idle. They reached forward to freedom and new labors when the time came. He wanted to be alone for a while, at least, and he was to return to America. His plan was to travel with a purpose in view, and to fill his life with work which would leave him little leisure. Rachel French had not yet left her father's house. St. Mirren had gone away with some suddenness immediately after the dinner party at which the political economist had reigned. Various comments had been made on his departure, but it was not easy to arrive at anything like a definite conclusion. Miss French was seen no more in town. Only a few servants remained with her in the house, and these maintained that she was going to Paris to her father's sister, with whom she had lived before her return from abroad. They added that there was no change in her demeanor, that she had dismissed their companions without any explanation. One, it is true, thought she was rather thin, and had gone off her looks. But this version was not popular, and was considered out of accordance with the ideal of her character held in the public mind. "She does nae care," it was said. "She is nae hurt. Her brass is safe enow, and that's a' as would be like to trouble her. Pale, indeed. She's too high and mighty." Murdoch made his preparations for departure as rapidly as possible. They were rather for his mother and Christian than for himself. They were to leave Broxton also, and he had found a home for them elsewhere. One day, as they sat in the little parlor, he rose hurriedly and went to Christian and took both her hands. "Try to be happy," he said. "Try to be happy." He spared no effort to make the future bright for them. He gave no thought to himself. His every hour was spent in thinking for and devising new comfort for them. But at last all was ready, and there was but one day left to them. The works was still closed, and would not be reopened for some weeks, but he had obtained permission to go down to his room and remove his possessions if he chose. So on the morning of this last day, he let himself into his den and shut himself up in it. Once behind the closed doors, he began a strange labor. He emptied drawers and desk, and burnt every scrap of paper to ashes, drawings, letters, all. Then he destroyed the delicate models and every other remnant of his past labors. There was not so much as an envelope or blotting pad remaining. When he had done, he made a clean sweep. The room was empty, cold, and bare. He sat down at last, in the midst of its desolate orderliness. At that moment a hand was laid upon the door handle, and the door opened. There was a rustle of a woman's dress, and Rachel French stood before him. "What are you doing here, in heaven's name?" he said, rising slowly to meet her. She cast one glance around the bare room. "It is true you are going away." "Yes," he answered, "I am going. I have done my last work here today." She made a step forward and stood looking at him. She spoke under her breath. "Everyone is going. My father has left me. A scarlet spot came out on her cheek, but she did not withdraw her eyes. St. Mirren has gone also." Gradually, as she looked at him, the blood receded from her face and left it like a mask of stone. She began in a sharp whisper. "Do you not see? Do you not understand? Ah, my God!" There was a chair near her, and she fell into it, burying her face in the crushed velvet of her mantle as she bowed herself upon the table near. "Hush!" she cried. "Do not speak to me. That it should be I who stooped, and for this, that having battled against my folly so long, I should have let it drag me to the dust at last." Her passionate sobs suffocated her. She could not check or control them. Her slender fingers writhed in their clasp upon each other. "I never thought of this, God knows," he said hoarsely, "though there have been hours when I could have sworn that you had loved me once. I have thought of all things, but never of this, never that you could repent." She lifted her head. "That I should repent?" she cried. "Repent like this?" "No," he returned. "I never thought of that, I swear." "And it is you," she cried, with scorn, "you, who stand there and look at me and tell me that it is all over." "Is it my fault that it is all over?" he demanded. "Is it?" "No," she answered. "This is my consolation." He drew nearer to her. "You left me nothing," he said. "Nothing. God knows what saved me. I do not." "You loved me? You battled against your love?" He laughed aloud. "I was a madman under your window night after night. Forget it, if you can. I cannot. Oh, that I should have stooped for this, you say. No, it is that I, who have loved you, should stand here with empty hands." She had bowed her face and was sobbing again, but suddenly she rose. "If I did not know you better," she said, "I should say this was revenge." "It would be, but a poor one," he answered her coldly. She supported herself with one hand on the chair. "I have fallen very low," she said, "so low that I was weaker than I thought. And now, as you say, it is over. Your hands are empty. Oh, it was a poor passion, and this is the fitting end for it." She moved a little toward the door and stopped. "Good-bye," she said. In a moment more, all that was left was a subtle breath of flower-like fragrance in the atmosphere of the bare room. It was an hour before he passed through the iron gates, though there had been nothing left to be done inside. He came out slowly, and having locked the gate, turned toward the Broxton Road. He was going to the little graveyard. It had been a dull gray day, but by the time he reached the place, the sun had crept through the clouds and brightened them. And noting it, he felt some vague comfort. It was a desolate place where there was no sun. When he reached the mound, he stood looking down. Since the night he had lain by it looking up at the sky and had made his resolve, the grass had grown longer and thicker and turned from green to brown. He spoke aloud, just as he had done before. "It is done," he said. "Your thought was that you dreamed it would be. I have kept my word." He stopped as if for an answer, but it was very still, so still that the silence was like a presence, and the mound at his feet lay golden brown in the sunlight, even its long grass unstirred. They left Broxton the next day, and in a week he set sail. As the ship moved away, he stood leaning upon the taffrail, watching a figure on the shore. It was a girl in a long cloak of gray, almost the color of the mist in which she stood, a slender, motionless figure, a dark young face turned seaward. He watched her until he could see her face no longer, but still she had not stirred. "When I return," he said, scarcely conscious that he spoke, "when I return, it will be to you." Then the grayness closed about her, and she faded slowly from his sight. End of chapter 54. Recording by John Brandon. End of Haworth's by Francis Hodgson Burnett.